I'm not dead yet. Please, please, someone has to believe me. Lena Carter's voice broke through the rain, thin as a thread pulled tight enough to snap, as she dragged her broken body through the mud, with one hand pressed over the swell of her stomach. And the man who put her there was already telling the police a very different story. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from tonight, because I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. The rain came down like it had a grudge against the earth, hammering the cracked asphalt of County Road 9 until the yellow lines disappeared under sheets of water. It was the kind of storm that emptied out gas stations and sent every sane person home early, the kind where thunder didn't roll so much as detonate one crack after another, close enough to rattle the fillings in your teeth. Lena Carter didn't remember screaming when the car door opened. She remembered the cold, first the shock of it, the way the wind ripped the breath out of her lungs before she even hit the gravel shoulder. Then she remembered rolling her shoulder, taking the brunt of it, then her hip, then something in her side that made a sound she would spend the rest of her life trying not to hear again in her dreams. And underneath all of it, underneath the pain screaming up her spine, was one single thought, clear and burning as a coal to baby. She curled around her stomach on instinct before her mind even caught up to what her body already knew to do. 7 months along, 7 months of hiding bruises under long sleeves, 7 months of telling her sister everything was fine, 7 months of believing because she wanted so badly to believe that Victor Hale still loved her, somewhere underneath all that ice. The car's taillights blurred red through the rain already 50 yards down the road. Not stopping, not even slowing. Victor! She tried to scream, but it came out as a wet, broken rasp swallowed whole by the storm. Victor! The taillights shrank to 2 dying embers, and then were gone, swallowed by the black throat of the county road, leaving her alone in a ditch that smelled of wet limestone and diesel exhaust. 7 months pregnant, ribs cracked and utterly, completely forgotten by the only man who was supposed to protect her. She tried to stand. Her left ankle buckled the instant she put weight on it, and she went down hard onto her knees in the mud, a sob tearing loose from somewhere she didn't know she had left. The ravine sloped down toward a drainage culvert choked with weeds, and gravity did what gravity does. It pulled her inch by inch deeper into the dark, until the road above her was just a gray smear through the rain and the trees. Somebody, she whispered to no one, to the storm, to God if he happened to be listening on a night like this. Please, somebody has to be out here. Her hand found her belly again, and beneath her palm, faint but unmistakable, she felt it, a small, stubborn kick. Still alive. Still fighting, as if the child inside her hadn't gotten the message that the world outside had already decided they were both disposable. Okay, Lena breathed, teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the word. Okay, baby. Okay, we're going to be okay. She didn't believe it. Not really, but saying it out loud was the only weapon she had left. 11 miles down that same stretch of road, in a roadside bar, with a busted neon sign that spelled HLLSA-NGLS because half the letters had burned out years ago, and nobody cared enough to fix them, Jack Ryder was nursing a coffee he didn't want, listening to the storm slap against the tin roof like it was trying to peel it off. Jack was 58 years old, built like a man who'd spent 4 decades either lifting engines or lifting weights, with a gray-streaked beard, forearms wrapped in faded ink that told the story of every brother he'd lost, and eyes that had seen enough ugliness in this world that very little surprised him anymore. He was the president of this chapter of the Hells Angels, and had been for 11 years, ever since the club's last president got buried in a cemetery 2 counties over. "You gonna drink that or just stare it to death?" asked Tank, sliding onto the stool beside him. Tank was younger, 30-something, built like a refrigerator, with a laugh that could rattle windows, but tonight even he looked subdued, watching the rain lash the parking lot, where a dozen motorcycles sat tarped and dripping. "Storm like this," Jack said, "makes a man think about roads he shouldn't be thinking about." "Which road?" Jack didn't answer right away. He turned his mug in a slow half circle on the bar top, watching the coffee ripple. "The one that took my brother," he said finally. 15 years ago tonight, almost to the hour." Tank went quiet. Everyone in the club knew the story, even if nobody talked about it much. How Danny Ryder had been arrested on a manslaughter charge that never should have stuck. How the trial had been rigged from the jury selection down to the judge's gavel. How Danny had died in a state prison 8 years into a sentence for a crime 3 separate witnesses said he didn't commit. And how the judge who sent him there was a man named Harold Hale, a name that still turned Jack's stomach to acid if he let himself think about it too long. "You want me to close up?" Tank asked. "Get everybody home before this gets worse." Jack was about to answer when the door blew open so hard it cracked against the wall, and a woman none of them recognized, soaked, wild-eyed, maybe 19 years old, stumbled in, gasping like she'd run the last mile barefoot. "There's a car," she managed, chest heaving. "There's a car stop, back on County 9 hazards on, and I thought I saw someone down in the ravine. I heard screaming. I didn't stop. I was scared. I don't know why I didn't stop." Jack was already off the stool. "Where exactly?" he said, voice suddenly ablaze with no give in it. "Past the old grain silo, maybe 2 miles. I swear I heard a woman screaming a name. I swear to God." Jack didn't wait for the rest. He was already pulling his jacket on, already jerking his head at Tank, at Preacher, at Diesel, at every man in that bar who'd ridden with him long enough to know what that look on his face meant. Within 90 seconds, 7 Harleys were roaring to life in the rain-slicked lot headlights, cutting cones of white through the downpour. And Jack Ryder led them out onto County Road 9 like a man chasing a ghost he'd been running from for 15 years. Lena had stopped trying to climb. Her body had simply refused, muscle by muscle, the way a machine shuts down when there's nothing left to burn. She lay half submerged in the cold runoff at the bottom of the ravine, cheek pressed against wet gravel eyes, fluttering between the black sky and something darker. Something that felt like the inside of her own eyelids, pulling shut for good. "Stay awake," she told herself, or maybe told the baby. She wasn't sure anymore which voice was doing the talking. "Stay awake. Stay awake, Lena. Don't you dare." That was when she heard it. Not thunder, something rhythmic under the thunder, a low mechanical growl that didn't belong to the storm at all. She thought she was imagining it the way drowning men imagine rescue boats. But it grew louder and louder until it was unmistakably real. The throaty roar of motorcycle engines, more than one, cutting through the rain like a war drum. "Help!" She tried to scream, but her voice had nothing left in it, just a cracked whisper swallowed by the storm. "Help me, please, I'm down here." The engine stopped. Headlights swept the tree line above the ravine, throwing long yellow shafts through the rain. She heard boots hit gravel. She heard voices, men's voices, hard and urgent. "Down there, I see something down there. Watch your footing, that slope's a mudslide waiting to happen." "Lena, is anybody down there? Say something if you can hear me." It was the girl's voice, she realized dimly, the one who must have called for help. And then a man's voice, deeper, closer, sliding down the embankment with the controlled recklessness of someone who'd done far more dangerous things than climb a wet hill in the dark. "I got a body," the voice called up. "She's alive. She's alive. I can see her breathing. Get the truck around. We need light down here now." Hands found her shoulders, rough hands, strong hands, careful in a way that surprised her given how big they were. Ma'am, can you hear me? My name's Jack. I need you to open your eyes for me if you can." Lena's eyelids fought the mud and the cold and the concussion throbbing behind her skull. But she forced them open, and the first thing she saw was a face she didn't know. Lined, weathered, a gray beard slicked flat with rain, eyes that held none of the cruelty she'd learned to expect from men in her life, only a fierce, focused urgency. "My baby," she croaked. It was the only thing that mattered enough to spend her remaining strength on. "Please, my baby. 7 months. Is my baby—" Hey, look at me." Jack's voice dropped, steadied, became something almost gentle, even as his hands moved with practiced speed to check her pulse, her pupils, the shallow, ragged rhythm of her breathing. You're breathing, that's good, that's real. Good. What is your name?" "Lena." A whimper. "Lena Carter." "Okay, Lena, I'm not gonna let anything happen to you or that baby. You understand me? Not tonight. Not while I'm standing here." "He tried to kill me," Lena whispered, and something in the way she said it, flat, exhausted, past the point of even being afraid to say it out loud, made Jack Ryder's blood go cold in a way the storm never could. "My husband, he opened the door. He pushed me out. He just drove away." Above them, Tank was sliding down the slope with the rescue kit and a rain slicker shouting something about an ambulance being 40 minutes out because of a downed tree on the interstate. And Jack made a decision in about half a second that would change the rest of his life and every life connected to it. 40 minutes she doesn't have, he barked. We're not waiting on an ambulance. Preacher, get the truck in here. Tailgate down, we're loading her ourselves. Diesel, call Mercy Ridge. Tell them we're coming in hot with a pregnant trauma patient, possible internal injuries, gestational age about 30 weeks. Somebody get a blanket, get her warm now. Jack, we can't just... I said now. Nobody argued with Jack Ryder when his voice dropped into that register. Within 4 minutes, Lena Carter was wrapped in 2 leather jackets in a wool blanket. Someone had in a saddlebag laid as gently as 7 grown bikers could manage across the bed of Preacher's pickup, and the convoy was tearing back down County Road 9 at a speed that made the rain feel like gravel against exposed skin. Jack rode alongside the truck, the whole way close enough to see her face through the rear window, every time the headlights of an oncoming car lit the cab. He watched her eyes drift shut, watched Tank riding in the bed beside her, one arm braced to keep her from sliding, shake her awake every time. Stay with us, ma'am. Come on, eyes open. We're almost there. Lena, Jack shouted through the rain, gunning his engine closer to the truck's window. Lena, you hear that engine under you? That's a Harley Panhead restored her myself over 11 winters. You stay awake, and when this is over, I'll tell you every boring detail about that carburetor. Deal? It was a stupid thing to say. It was the kind of thing you said to keep a dying woman's mind tethered to something, anything other than the darkness trying to claim her. And impossibly, through cracked lips and chattering teeth, Lena Carter almost laughed. Deal, she whispered. Mercy Ridge Hospital's emergency bay lit up like a flare the moment the truck skidded to a stop under the awning. Nurses and a trauma team spilled out with a gurney before the engine had even cut off, and for one terrifying moment there was chaos, shouted vitals, hands everywhere, a doctor barking orders about fetal heart monitoring, an OB team being paged overhead. 30-year-old female, approximately 30 weeks gestation, found in a ravine off County 9, hypothermic, possible fractured ribs, left ankle fracture, patient reports being forcibly ejected from a moving vehicle. Fetal heart rate. Getting it, now there it is, 140 steady. Lena's hand shot out from the gurney and closed around Jack's wrist with a strength that startled him. Her eyes glassy with exhaustion and fear locked onto his. Don't leave, she rasped. Please, he'll come and he'll say I'm crazy. He'll say I fell. He'll say, please don't let them believe him. I'm not going anywhere, Jack said, and meant it with a certainty that surprised even him. Nobody in this building's gonna hurt you while I'm standing here. That's a promise, and I don't make those lightly. The gurney disappeared through double doors that swung shut with a pneumatic hiss, and Jack Ryder stood in the harsh fluorescent light of the emergency bay, rain still dripping off his jacket onto the tile floor. 6 of his brothers gathered around him, soaked and grim-faced, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt something he thought he'd buried alongside his brother Danny, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was a fight left in him worth having. Jack, Tank said quietly, you hear what she said back there about her husband? I heard it. You think it's true? Jack looked at the doors the gurney had vanished through, at the reflection of the storm still hammering the glass entrance behind them, and for a long moment he didn't answer. I think, he said finally, that a woman doesn't crawl through a ravine 7 months pregnant, half dead, and waste her last breath making up a lie. I think somebody threw her out of that car like she was garbage, and I think we just became the only thing standing between her and whoever did it. Inside the trauma bay, Dr. Amara Whitfield moved through the controlled chaos with the calm precision of someone who'd spent 18 years learning not to let her hands shake no matter what walked through those doors. She was in her 50s, silver threading through dark hair pulled back tight, and she'd delivered enough babies under enough terrible circumstances to recognize the particular gravity of this one. Fetal monitors holding steady 142, called the OB resident, but we've got some decelerations. Dr. Whitfield, I don't love the pattern. Get me an ultrasound now, and somebody find out if this woman has any allergies, any medical history, anything. Whitfield leaned over Lena, whose eyes were fighting to stay open under the harsh lights. Lena, honey, I'm Dr. Whitfield. I need you to stay with me. Can you tell me if you've had any bleeding? Any cramping before tonight? No, Lena managed. I was fine. I was fine until he... Her breath hitched a sound halfway between a sob and a laugh at the absurdity of her own life, until he opened the car door on the highway doing 40 miles an hour and pushed me out like I was nothing. The room went very still for a fraction of a second. Nurses exchanged glances. Whitfield's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only crack in her professional composure. "Who did this to you?" Whitfield asked, voice low, steady. "My husband." Lena's hand found her belly again, that same protective instinct that had guided her through the mud and the rain and the 11 miles of terror. Victor Hale. The name landed in that trauma bay like a stone, dropped into still water, rippling outward in ways Lena didn't yet understand. A young nurse near the door, a local girl born and raised in the county, went pale and glanced instinctively toward the hallway, as if expecting the ceiling to come down on her for even hearing that name spoken aloud in accusation. "Doctor," the nurse whispered, pulling Whitfield aside for half a second. "Hale, that's Judge Hale's son. Judge Harold Hale." Whitfield's expression didn't change, not outwardly, but something behind her eyes sharpened into focus the way a soldier's does when the terrain suddenly reveals itself to be a minefield. "That," Whitfield said quietly, "doesn't change a single thing about how we treat this patient. Get me that ultrasound." Duh. Out in the waiting room, Jack Ryder sat in a plastic chair, built for someone half his size, elbows on his knees, watching the clock crawl toward 1 in the morning. Tank paced. Preacher and Diesel had gone to move the bikes to proper parking and hadn't come back yet, probably drying off somewhere, probably calling their old ladies to say they'd be late, probably not telling them why. "You believe in fate, Jack?" Tank asked, dropping into the seat beside him. "I believe in bad luck and worse men," Jack said. "Fate's just what people call it after the fact, so it sounds like it meant something." 15 years to the night, Tank said quietly. "Danny, and now this." Jack's hands curled into fists on his knees, knuckles whitening. He didn't need reminding. He'd been counting the years himself every single day since they buried his brother in a plot the state paid for because Jack couldn't afford anything better back then, back when the club had nothing back, when Judge Harold Hale's gavel had come down on Danny Ryder's life like it was swatting a fly. "You think it's connected?" Tank pressed. "Her husband and Haman." "I don't know yet," Jack said, "but I intend to find out." Before Tank could respond, the emergency bay doors swung open again, and this time it wasn't medical staff. It was a man in an expensive charcoal suit, soaked through despite an umbrella he still clutched uselessly at his side, his face a mask of practiced, camera-ready anguish. He was tall, handsome in the sculpted gym and Botox way of men who'd never done a day of honest labor, and the moment he stepped through those doors, every eye in the waiting room turned toward him. "Where is she?" The man said, voice cracking on cue, loud enough for every nurse, every security guard, every bystander to hear. "Where's my wife? Someone please, I need to see my wife. I need to know if my baby's okay." Jack Ryder rose slowly from his chair. 6'2" of gray-bearded stillness, and something in his gaze made the man freeze mid-stride. "You must be Victor," Jack said, voice quiet, almost pleasant, which somehow made it worse. Victor Hale blinked, thrown off balance by the presence of a leather-clad stranger who clearly already knew exactly who he was. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "No," Jack said, "but your wife does. She told us everything on the way here." For half a second, so brief that later, when Jack replayed it in his mind 100 times, he'd almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. Something flickered behind Victor Hale's eyes, not grief, not fear for his wife. Something colder, calculating, like a man rapidly recalculating a math problem that had just changed variables. Then it was gone, replaced instantly by trembling lips and glassy eyes. She's confused," Victor said, voice hitching theatrically. "She's been having episodes, delusions, ever since the pregnancy. The doctors warned us about prenatal stress on her mental health. I've been so worried about her. You have to understand, she's not. She doesn't always know what's real." "Funny," Jack said, taking one slow step closer, close enough that Victor had to tilt his head back to hold eye contact, close enough that the smell of expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the sour tang of fear sweat underneath it. "She seemed pretty clear on the fact that you opened a car door doing 40 miles an hour on County 9 and shoved her out into a ravine." Victor's composure cracked for exactly 1 second. One raw, unguarded second where his mouth opened and nothing came out, where his eyes darted toward the emergency doors like a cornered animal calculating an exit. Then a security guard stepped between them, and Victor recovered instantly, pivoting into fresh sobs, into a performance so seamless it would have fooled anyone who hadn't just watched the mask slip. I would never, my God, is that what she's saying? She fell, there was an accident. I've been trying to find her for hours. I called the police the second I realized she wasn't in the car. That's not what happened, and we both know it, Jack said low enough now that only Victor could hear him. And I've got 6 witnesses who pulled her out of that ravine and heard every word she said before you ever walked through that door. You're not going to gaslight your way out of this one, son. Sir, I'm going to need you to step back, the security guard said to Jack, hand raised clearly, more comfortable de-escalating a leather-jacketed biker than a man in an $800 suit with tears on cue. Jack stepped back. He didn't need to push further tonight. He'd seen what he needed to see, the crack in the performance, the flicker of calculation, the split-second truth hiding underneath the grief. That was enough for now. But Victor Hale wasn't finished. He turned to the nursing station, voice rising urgent, desperate, in exactly the way that made hospital staff want to help him. I need to speak to whoever's treating her. I'm her husband. I have every legal right to be informed of her condition, and frankly, I'm concerned, deeply concerned about her state of mind. She said things before, paranoid things, about people following her, about conspiracies. I've been begging her to see someone. A young nurse, sympathetic and clearly rattled by the scene, moved to consult the charge nurse. Jack watched it happen in real time, watched the machinery of institutional trust begin almost imperceptibly to tilt in Victor's favor, simply because he was well-dressed and well-spoken and knew exactly which words to use. Tank, Jack said quietly, not taking his eyes off Victor. Get Preacher on the phone. Tell him I need every man who can ride to be here within the hour. We are not leaving this hospital tonight. You think he'll try something, here with security around? I think a man who tried to kill his pregnant wife on a public road isn't going to think twice about finishing the bomb in a building full of people too scared to stop him, Jack said. And I think if we're not standing between him and that door, somebody's going to hand him exactly what he wants, his unstable wife alone, with no one to contradict his version of events. 2 hours later, in a private room on the 3rd floor, with a police officer stationed halfway-heartedly outside, more out of hospital protocol than any genuine sense of urgency, Lena Carter lay hooked to monitors that beeped in a rhythm that had finally mercifully stabilized. Her ankle was in a temporary splint. 2 ribs were confirmed fractured. The ultrasound had shown a baby girl, still small for her gestational age, but with a strong heartbeat and no signs of placental abruption. A miracle Dr. Whitfield hadn't wanted to promise, but couldn't stop herself from quietly believing in. Jack sat in a chair just inside the doorway, arms crossed, having flatly refused 3 separate requests from hospital administration to leave. Tank stood in the hallway. Preacher and Diesel had returned with 4 more brothers, and together they occupied enough of the 3rd floor waiting area that the nursing staff had started routing other visitors around them like a natural obstacle. You didn't have to stay, Lena said quietly, her voice still raw, watching Jack through half-lidded eyes, heavy with the exhaustion of trauma and mild sedation. I told you I would. People say things like that all the time. Doesn't mean they mean it. I mean everything I say, Jack said. It's a character flaw. Ask anybody who's ever tried to argue with me. A ghost of a smile crossed Lena's cracked lips, gone as quickly as it came, replaced by something heavier. He's going to make me look crazy, she whispered. He's already started, hasn't he? I saw it in your face when you came back in. What did he say? Jack considered lying to spare her. He decided against it. He's telling people you've been having delusions, paranoid episodes. Says the pregnancy's affecting your mental health. Lena's eyes closed, and for a moment Jack thought she might cry. But when she opened them again, there was something harder there, something forged in the ravine, in the rain, and 11 miles of crawling through mud to survive. That's what he does, she said. That's exactly what he does. He did it to my mother-in-law before she disappeared to get help at some facility 3 states away that nobody's ever visited her at. He did it to his first wife before me. I found out about her 6 months into our marriage, found her name in old paperwork, tried to look her up. She doesn't exist anymore. Not online, not anywhere, just gone. Her hand tightened around the thin hospital blanket. I should have run the day I found that paperwork. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself I was safe because his father is a judge, because everyone respects them, because surely a family like that. She broke off, disgusted with her own past naivety. Surely a family like that couldn't be capable of something like this. Judge Hale, Jack said carefully, testing the name in his mouth like it might bite him. Harold Hale. You know him? Jack's jaw tightened. 15 years of buried grief pressed up against his sternum like a fist. I know him, he said. He sent my brother to prison for a crime 3 witnesses swore he didn't commit. Danny died in that prison 8 years later. Never got out. Never got a retrial no matter how many appeals we filed. Lena's breath caught. She stared at Jack with something like recognition, like 2 people who'd survived different wrecks of the same storm, suddenly realizing they'd been circling the same wreckage for years without knowing it. Then you understand, she whispered, why nobody's going to believe me. Why the police already looked at me tonight like I was the problem, not him. Why every doctor who walks through that door is going to have Victor's version of events whispered in their ear before they even ask me a single question. I understand it, Jack said. And I'm telling you right now in front of Gum and 6 of my brothers standing in that hallway that's not happening. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not for as long as it takes. Why? Lena asked, and there was no accusation in it, only genuine exhausted bewilderment. Why would you do this? You don't know me. I'm nobody to you. Jack was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over, deciding how much truth to give her. 15 years ago, he said finally, I stood outside a courthouse and watched a system built by men like Harold Hale swallow my brother whole, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. I was younger then, angrier but weaker, didn't have the club behind me, the way I do now, didn't have the resources, didn't have the years of learning how these people operate. I've spent every day since telling myself if I ever got another chance to stand between someone and that same machine, I wouldn't waste it. He looked at her, at the fierce, exhausted, unbreakable woman lying in that hospital bed with a fractured ankle and 2 broken ribs and a heartbeat monitor, tracking a daughter who by all rights should not have survived tonight. Tonight, Jack said. I got my chance. Lena's eyes welled, but she didn't let the tears fall. Some stubborn pride refusing to give Victor Hale the satisfaction even in his absence. He's not going to stop, she said quietly. You need to understand that before you commit to this. Victor doesn't lose. He's never lost anything in his life, not once, because his father makes sure of it. If you stand in his way, he'll come for you too. Jack Ryder leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, a small, grim smile finding its way through his beard for the first time all night. Ma'am, he said, men have been trying to make Jack Ryder disappear for 40 years. I'm still here. And so as of about 2 hours ago are you, Jim. Outside the hospital in the parking structure 3 levels down, Victor Hale sat in his car, a replacement borrowed from a colleague, since his own vehicle was currently the subject of a fabricated theft report he'd filed with the local sheriff's department 20 minutes earlier. A sheriff who owed his position to Judge Harold Hale and who would, Victor knew with absolute certainty, ask exactly 0 uncomfortable questions. His hands were shaking, not from grief, from fury. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart, and it rang twice before a voice, gravel-worn and irritated at the hour, answered. It's 1 a.m, Victor. This had better be good. She's alive, Victor said, voice tight and controlled, now that there was no audience left to perform for. Some bikers pulled her out of the ravine before what, Victor? The voice on the other end went very quiet, very dangerous. Before you finished what you were supposed to finish. I panicked, Victor hissed. The storm, the road? I thought it doesn't matter what I thought. She's alive, and she's talking, Dad, and there's a whole gang of Hell's Angels standing guard outside her hospital room like she's some kind of martyr. There was a long silence on the line. When Judge Harold Hale spoke again, his voice had settled into something cold and administrative. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years learning that problems were simply variables waiting to be solved by whoever controlled the equation. Bikers, Harold said slowly, have no standing, no legal authority, no credibility in front of a judge. Any judge, but especially the ones I've spent 30 years appointing to this county. You let them play their little heroes in leather routine tonight. Tomorrow we start building the paper trail that says your wife has been mentally unstable for months. We get an emergency psychiatric evaluation ordered. We get temporary custody proceedings started on that baby the moment it's born, citing maternal instability. And in 6 months, when this is all over, nobody is going to remember the name of a single one of those bikers because nobody is going to care what a gang of criminals thinks happened on a dark road in a rainstorm. And if she keeps talking, if she keeps telling people then we make sure the people she's talking to have already been told she's not to be believed, Harold said. I've built this county for 30 years, Victor. I'm not about to let a woman I never approved of and a pack of degenerates on motorcycles unravel it in one night. Go home, get some rest, cry a little more if anyone's watching, and let me handle the rest. The line went dead. Victor sat in the dark of the parking structure for a long moment, staring up at the lit windows of the hospital, one of which he was fairly certain belonged to his wife's room, and something ugly and satisfied settled behind his eyes. He had lost control tonight. He would not lose control again. Back on the third floor, long after midnight had bled into the small, brittle hours of early morning, Jack Ryder stood at the window of the hallway outside Lena's room, watching the last of the storm clouds finally break apart to reveal a thin, cold scrap of moon. Tank approached quietly, holding 2 vending machine coffees, offering one to Jack without a word. You really think this is connected to Danny? Tank asked finally. Or is that just old grief talking? Jack took a long sip of coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard and didn't answer right away. Down the hall through the narrow window in Lena's door, he could see the shape of her sleeping form, the soft blue glow of the fetal monitor pulsing steadily, faithfully in the dark. 15 years ago, Jack said, I told myself Harold Hale was untouchable. Told myself there was nothing left to do but grieve and move on because men like that don't fall. The system protects its own, always has, always will. He turned to look at Tank, and something had shifted in his face, something that hadn't been there in a very long time. But I'm looking at a woman in there who crawled through a ravine 7 months pregnant rather than lie down and die quiet the way Harold Hale expects women like her to die. And I'm thinking maybe I was wrong 15 years ago. Maybe men like that don't fall because nobody's ever stood in front of them long enough, hard enough, and refused to move. And you think that's us, a bunch of bikers in a broken hospital bed? Jack looked back through the window at Lena Carter's sleeping face, at the small, defiant rise and fall of her chest, at the monitor tracking a second heartbeat that refused against every terrible odds to stop. I think, Jack Ryder said quietly, that tonight in that ravine, that woman decided she wasn't going to die on Victor Hale's terms. And I think the second we pulled her out of that mud, we made the same decision for ourselves, whether we knew it yet or not. He set his coffee down on the windowsill untouched and settled back into the plastic chair outside her door, prepared to sit there through the rest of the night, through the following day, through however long it took, because Jack Ryder had made a promise in a rainstorm to a dying woman in a ditch, and whatever else the world took from him, it was never, ever going to take his word. Somewhere down the corridor, the elevator doors chimed softly open, and 2 uniformed police officers stepped out. Expressions carefully neutral, carrying a folder that had arrived quietly and efficiently, less than 3 hours after a phone call between a father and his son, a folder with a case number, a preliminary psychiatric hold request, and a judge's signature already impossibly affixed to the bottom. Jack Ryder watched them approach, felt Tank straighten beside him, felt the weight of every brother now gathered in that hallway shift their attention toward the officers with the same quiet, unshakable resolve. The war Lena Carter had warned him about wasn't coming tomorrow. It had already arrived. The 2 officers stopped 6 feet from Jack Ryder's chair, and the taller one, a young man with a buzz cut and a nameplate that read, Officer Delgado, cleared his throat like he already regretted being here. We're looking for the patient in room 314, Delgado said. Lena Carter. She's sleeping, Jack said, not moving from the chair. Whatever's in that folder can wait until morning. Sir, I understand you have concerns, but we have a court order here requiring an emergency psychiatric evaluation. It's signed by a judge. Which judge? Jack asked, though he already knew the answer sitting like a stone in his gut. Delgado hesitated, glanced at his partner, then read the name off the paper like it physically pained him to say it out loud. Judge Harold Hale. The father of the man who threw her out of a moving car tonight, Jack said, signed the order to have her committed, less than 4 hours after it happened. Sir, that's not a coincidence, officer. That's a father protecting his son, and you're standing here holding the paperwork he used to do it. Tank shifted his weight beside Jack, arms crossed, and behind him, 4 more Hell's Angels rose from where they'd been slouched in plastic chairs, forming a loose wall of leather, and silence that made both officers distinctly aware of how outnumbered they were. Delgado's partner, an older cop with tired eyes named Ruiz, put a hand lightly on his partner's shoulder. "Nobody's dragging anybody out of a hospital bed tonight," Ruiz said quietly, more to Delgado than to Jack. "Not without a doctor signing off first. That's protocol, judge's order or not. The order says immediate transport for evaluation." Delgado pressed through his voice had lost some of its starch. "And I'm telling you, Tom," came a new voice from down the hall, sharp and clipped with authority, "that no patient of mine leaves this floor without my medical clearance, court order or not." Dr. Whitfield strode toward them, still in her scrubs from the delivery, 2 rooms down, silver hair coming loose from its clip, exhaustion etched into every line of her face, but her eyes hard as flint. She snatched the folder out of Delgado's hands and scanned it in seconds, the practiced speed of someone who'd read 1,000 pieces of paperwork trying to move a patient before she was ready. "This order cites erratic behavior and delusions reported by immediate family." Whitfield read aloud, disgust flattening her voice. "The only family member who's reported anything tonight is the husband who was seen fleeing the scene of an assault on this woman. I examined Lena Carter myself less than 3 hours ago. She is lucid, coherent, oriented to time and place, and currently 31 weeks pregnant with a documented fetal heart rate irregularity that requires monitoring, not transport to a psychiatric facility 40 minutes away in a storm." "Ma'am, we're just following." "You're following an order signed by a man whose son is the reason this woman has 2 fractured ribs," Whitfield snapped. "You want to move her? Fine. Get me a second physician's evaluation. Get me an actual psychiatric consult from someone in this building who's examined her, and if they agree with this order, I'll walk her to the ambulance myself. Until then, she doesn't move an inch, and you can tell whoever signed that paper I said so." The 2 officers exchanged a long look. Particular look of men who'd been sent to do a job neither of them wanted in a building full of witnesses against a doctor who clearly wasn't bluffing. "We'll need to note this in our report," Delgado said, finally, some face-saving reflex kicking in. "Note away," Whitfield said, "and note the time, 3:40 in the morning. I want it on record exactly how fast Judge Hale moved to get a woman sedated and shipped out before she could talk to anyone else." The officers retreated toward the elevator, murmuring into radios, and the second the doors slid shut behind them, Jack finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "That's round 1, Whitfield said, turning to him, something like grim respect flickering across her tired face. "There'll be a round 2. Men like Harold Hale don't stop after 1 denied order. He'll be back with a better lawyer and a more convincing folder by sunrise." "Then we'll be here at sunrise too," Jack said. "I'm sure you will." Whitfield studied him a moment longer, something curious in her gaze. "You really don't know her, do you, before tonight?" "Never met her in my life." "And yet," Whitfield shook her head slowly, some private calculation resolving behind her eyes, "there's a room on this floor set aside for family only after visiting hours. I'm going to go ahead and misclassify 7 bikers as family, because frankly, tonight you've done more to protect that woman than anyone with an actual blood relation to her. Don't make me regret it." She turned and walked back down the hallway before Jack could even thank her, disappearing through the doors toward the NICU, where 3 floors below, reality's cruelty, a handful of premature infants fought their own private wars nobody outside those walls would ever see. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a sky scrubbed, pale and raw, and Lena woke to sunlight cutting weak lines across the hospital blanket and the sight of Jack Ryder still sitting in the same chair looking like he hadn't slept a wink. "You're still here," she said, voice thick with sleep and lingering pain. "Told you I would be. They came for me last night, didn't they?" It wasn't a question. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes and the way Tank stood a little too alert by the window. "I heard voices. I thought I dreamed it." "You didn't dream it," Jack said. "Judge Hale tried to get you transferred for a psych evaluation about 4 hours after we pulled you out of that ravine. Dr. Whitfield shut it down." Lena closed her eyes, and for a moment Jack thought she might break, might finally let the dam crack after a night that would have shattered most people twice over. Instead, when she opened her eyes again, there was something colder there, something calculating. "He's not going to stop," she said. "You need to understand something about Victor. He doesn't lash out in anger and regret it later. Every single thing he does is planned 3 moves ahead. The car door wasn't an accident of rage. It was calculated. He picked that stretch of road because there's no cameras, no witnesses, no houses for 6 miles. He probably had a story ready before he even opened that door. What story? That I've been unstable. Suicidal, maybe. That I threatened to hurt myself and the baby, and he tried to stop me, and I fought him and fell out during the struggle. Lena's mouth twisted bitterly. He's done this kind of groundwork before. There's a woman, his first wife, Rebecca. Nobody's heard from her in 6 years. I found paperwork, once medical records, showing a psychiatric commitment right before she disappeared from all public record. I was so afraid of him by the time I found it that I told myself I imagined the whole thing. Jack leaned forward, forearms on his knees. You said his fathers had been doing this for 30 years. Buying witnesses, erasing evidence. That's not something one judge does alone, not for that long. That takes a whole machine, cops willing to look away, court clerks willing to lose paperwork, a district attorney who never asked the wrong question. You sound like you've thought about this before, Lena said, studying him. I have, Jack said quietly, for 15 years. Before Lena could ask him to explain, the door opened, and a woman in a sharp navy blazer stepped in, flashing a badge before either of them could react. Special Agent Rachel Torres, FBI, she said. I'd like a few minutes with Mrs. Carter, if that's all right. Jack rose halfway out of his chair, protective instinct flaring, but Torres held up a hand unbothered. Relax, biker. I'm not here on Judge Hale's payroll. Quite the opposite. She pulled out a small folder of her own, different from the one Delgado had carried hours earlier, thinner, more worn, the kind of folder that had clearly been opened and closed 100 times over a very long investigation. I've had eyes on Harold Hale's court for the better part of 2 years. Judicial corruption, bribery, obstruction. We've had enough smoke to know there's fire, but never enough hard evidence to bring charges that would actually stick. Then last night, dispatch logs show a psychiatric transport order got filed for a domestic assault victim less than 4 hours after the incident, signed personally by the judge whose son is the accused. Torres's eyes flicked to Lena. That's not smoke anymore, Mrs. Carter. That's the first real crack I've seen in 2 years of digging. Lena's breath caught. You think you can actually stop him? Both of them. I think, Torres said carefully, that for the first time, I have a living witness who survived an attempt on her life instead of just a paper trail of people who disappeared before they could talk. That makes you either the most important person in this investigation or the most dangerous loose end Victor and Harold Hale have ever had to deal with. Possibly both. The weight of that landed in the room like a hell breath. I want to help, Lena said immediately, no hesitation. Whatever you need. Lena, Jack started, a note of caution creeping into his voice. No. Lena's hand tightened into the blanket, and something in her face hardened into a resolve Jack recognized because he'd worn that same expression 15 years ago, standing outside a courthouse, watching a system devour his brother whole. I spent 7 months telling myself I was imagining things, telling myself I was safe because of who his family was. I almost died last night because I waited too long to believe my own eyes. I am not doing that again. Torres studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, something like respect passing over her features. Then let's start with the car, she said, pulling out a small recorder. Tell me exactly what happened. Every detail you can remember, no matter how small. 2 floors down in the hospital's underground parking structure, a black sedan pulled into a reserved spot marked with a small brass plaque that read, Reserved County Officials. And a man stepped out who didn't need to introduce himself to anyone who'd lived in this county longer than a year. Judge Harold Hale was 71 years old, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, even at this ungodly hour. Moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once in 3 decades been told no and meant to keep that streak alive. He found Victor waiting for him near the elevator, looking like he hadn't slept, which Harold noted with quiet contempt was probably the only honest thing about his son's appearance in the last 12 hours. The psych order got denied, Victor said, before his father even reached him. Some doctors shut it down, and there's a woman FBI agent up there right now talking to Lena. Harold's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very still, very cold. FBI, he repeated. Agent Torres, I recognize the name. She's been sniffing around the courthouse for months, Dad. You told me yourself, you said it was nothing. It was nothing, Harold said sharply, because there was never anything for her to find. Now there is a live witness with a story and an audience willing to believe her. He rubbed his temple, calculating, and Victor watched his father's face cycle through the same cold machinery he'd watched operate for 30 years, solving problems the way other men solve crossword puzzles. We need to control the narrative before Torres builds a case around it. Get me Marcus Webb on the phone. The district attorney, he owes me 11 years of favors, Victor, starting with the fact that he sits in that office because I made sure of it. I want him filing motions by this afternoon questioning Torres's jurisdiction on a case that hasn't even been formally opened as federal. I want procedural friction delays, anything that buys us time. Harold's eyes narrowed. And I want to know exactly which bikers pulled her out of that ravine. Every name, every record. Men like that always have something buried in their past. IS assault charges, something we can use to paint them as unreliable if this ever gets in front of a jury. And Lena, Harold's jaw tightened, and for just a moment, something genuinely dangerous flickered across his composed features. Lena Carter, he said slowly, made herself a problem the moment she survived. We're going to solve that problem the correct way this time. Legally, quietly, with paperwork instead of car doors, because apparently that's a lesson you needed to learn the hard way. Victor flinched at the rebuke but said nothing. Get me everything on that trust, Harold continued. The moment that baby is born, did I want emergency custody proceedings filed citing maternal instability? And I want a judge sympathetic to our family sitting on that bench. Not me, obviously, given the conflict, but someone who remembers who put them there. If we control the child, we control the trust. And if we control the trust, none of this, the bikers, the FBI, any of it matters in the slightest. Back on the third floor, Rachel Torres finished recording Lena's account and clicked off her recorder. Her expression grim, but satisfied, like a woman who just found the first solid foothold on a mountain she'd been circling for years. This is good, Torres said. This is more than good, but I'm going to be straight with you. Harold Hale is not going to sit still while I build a case. He's going to come at this from every angle he can, and some of those angles are going to look a lot more legitimate than a psych transport order. Custody proceedings, restraining orders filed against you instead of him. Character witnesses paid to say you've always been unstable. You need to be ready for all of it. I understand, Lena said. I don't think you do. Not yet, and I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying it because I need you to survive the next several months, not just the next several days. Torres leaned forward. Is there anyone at all who can corroborate what you've told me? Anyone who saw the bruises before tonight? Anyone who heard him threaten you, any paper trail at all? Lena's mind raced backward through months of careful concealment, of long sleeves and summer heat, of canceled lunches with her sister, because a fresh bruise on her collarbone would have been impossible to explain. And then something surfaced, something she'd almost forgotten in the chaos of survival. Mason, she said suddenly. Mason Gray. Who's that? He used to be a defense attorney here in the county. Disbarred a few years back. Victor and his father made sure of that actually, though. I didn't understand why at the time. I met him once at a fundraiser years ago before I married Victor. He pulled me aside and told me to be careful that he'd represented a woman years earlier who tried to leave the Hale family, and things had gone very badly for her. I thought he was drunk and dramatic at the time. I didn't understand it until much later what he meant. Torres's pen stopped moving. Mason Gray, she repeated slowly. I know that name. He filed a wrongful conviction appeal about 8 years ago, a case involving a man named Danny Ryder, Jack said quietly from the doorway, his voice suddenly hoarse. Torres turned surprised. You know him. He was my brother's attorney, Jack said, something raw cracking through his composure for the first time since the ravine. The one who tried to get his conviction overturned before he died in prison. Mason Gray got disbarred right after he filed that appeal. Official reason was some technical violation, but everybody in this county knew the truth. Harold Hale ruined that man's career for daring to challenge one of his convictions. The room went silent, the weight of coincidence, or perhaps not coincidence, at all settling over everyone present. He's still in the county, Torres asked. Last I heard, Jack said, he does odd legal consulting work out of a rundown office above a laundromat on 5th Street. Nobody hires him for real cases anymore. Nobody who wants to keep their own career intact anyway. Torres was already standing, already gathering her folder. I need to talk to him today. If he's got knowledge of prior cases where the Hale family buried evidence or silenced witnesses, that's exactly the pattern evidence I need to build a RICO case instead of a single assault charge that Victor's lawyers will spend a year arguing about jurisdiction on. I'll take you, Jack said immediately. I appreciate the offer, but I generally don't conduct federal interviews with a biker gang as backup. Club, Jack corrected, not a gang. And Mason Gray knows me, knows my brother's case inside and out. He's more likely to talk freely with someone he trusts standing in the room than a federal agent showing up cold at his door after everything the Hale family already put him through. Torres considered this, weighing caution against pragmatism, and something in Jack's steady, unwavering gaze must have tipped the scale. Fine, she said, but you stay quiet and let me ask the questions. And Mrs. Carter, she turned back to Lena, softening slightly. You focus on getting stronger. That baby needs you healthy more than this investigation needs you exhausting yourself, worrying about every move Harold Hale makes. I'll be back by evening with whatever we find. Or no. Mason Gray's office sat above a laundromat exactly where Jack remembered it, the stairwell smelling of detergent and mildew, the frosted glass door bearing his name in peeling gold letters that had clearly seen better decades. Torres knocked twice before a voice inside grunted, something that might have been, "Come in," or might have been a cough. Mason Gray was 62, though he looked closer to 75, a man who'd once commanded courtrooms with sharp suits and sharper arguments, and now sat behind a desk cluttered with yellowing case files, a bottle of bourbon within easy reach despite the early hour. His eyes bloodshot but startlingly alert the moment he registered who was standing in his doorway. Jack Ryder, Mason said slowly, setting down a chipped coffee mug. Been a long time. Heard about the club taking in some pregnant woman off County 9 last night. County's a small place word travels. This is Agent Torres, FBI, Jack said. She's investigating Harold Hale. Mason's expression didn't change, but his hand found the bourbon bottle and pushed it a few inches further away, a small telling gesture. Everybody investigates Harold Hale eventually, he said. Nobody ever gets anywhere. You'll forgive me if I don't get my hopes up, Agent. I've watched better lawyers than me try and fail for 30 years. I'm not asking you to hope, Torres said, sitting across from him without waiting for an invitation. I'm asking you to talk. Specifically about a pattern I think you've spent years watching from the inside: women connected to the Hale family, disappearing from public record witnesses, recanting testimony right before trial, evidence vanishing from evidence lockers. You filed an appeal 8 years ago on behalf of Danny Ryder. 2 weeks later, you were disbarred on what the state bar called a technical filing violation. I've read that filing violation, Mr. Gray. It was nothing. It was an excuse. Mason was quiet for a long moment, staring at the water-stained ceiling, like it might offer him some kind of absolution for the years of silence. You want to know why I stopped fighting, he said finally. Because 6 months after Danny Ryder's appeal got thrown out and I got disbarred, my daughter's fiancé was arrested on a drug charge that every piece of physical evidence said couldn't have happened the way the report claimed. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? I got the message loud and clear. Harold Hale doesn't threaten you directly. He just makes sure you understand, without a single word ever being said out loud, exactly what he's capable of reaching. And now, Jack asked quietly, Danny's dead, Mason. 8 years in that prison, and he's dead. There's a woman upstairs at Mercy Ridge who almost joined a very long list of people who crossed this family and disappeared. How many more before somebody says enough? Mason's bloodshot eyes flicked between them, something old and buried and painful working its way to the surface. There was a woman, he said slowly, years before Danny's case. Rebecca, Victor's first wife. She came to my office. This was before I got disbarred, obviously terrified, saying Victor had tried to hurt her, saying his father was already preparing paperwork to have her declared unfit, mentally unstable before she'd even filed for divorce. I told her I'd help. I filed a protective order. 2 days later, the filing disappeared from the court record, entirely not denied, not dismissed, just gone like it never existed. Judge Hale claimed clerical error. A week after that, Rebecca Hale was committed to a psychiatric facility upstate on a court order I never saw coming and could never get overturned. She's been there ever since. 6 years. Nobody visits her. Nobody talks about her. It's like the entire county agreed to pretend she simply evaporated. Torres had gone very still, pen frozen over her notepad. Which facility? Ridgemont Behavioral, 3 counties over. I tried to visit once, years ago. They told me she'd requested no visitors. I never believed that for a second, but I had no legal standing left to challenge it by then. Mason's voice cracked slightly. I've carried that woman's face in my head for 6 years, Agent Torres, wondering if there was more I could have done, knowing there probably wasn't, not against a man who controls every court, every clerk, every filing cabinet in this county. There's more you can do now, Torres said. Would you testify officially on the record about the pattern you witnessed, the disappearing filings, the disbarment, everything? Mason laughed a bitter, exhausted sound. You want me to testify against Harold Hale, Agent? The man ended my career with a phone call. What exactly do you think he'll do to the rest of my life if I stand up in a federal courtroom and say his name out loud? I think, Torres said, leaning forward, that for the first time in 6 years, you have a federal agent sitting across from you who isn't going to let that filing disappear. I think you have a surviving witness, one floor of a hospital, telling the same story Rebecca told you 6 years ago, except this time she's alive to keep telling it. And I think somewhere in that pile of yellowing case files behind you, there's probably documentation you kept, copies you made, instincts you followed because some part of you always knew this day might come. Mason was quiet for a long, long moment. Then slowly he turned in his creaking chair and pulled open a bottom drawer that hadn't been opened in what looked like years, retrieving a thick, dust-covered folder held together with a rubber band that snapped when he touched it. I kept copies, he admitted quietly, of everything. The original protective order filing before it disappeared. Correspondence, my own case notes on 3 other instances over the years, where evidence in Hale-adjacent cases behaved in ways that defied every law of probability. He set the folder on the desk between them like it weighed considerably more than paper should. I told myself I kept these for my own sanity, proof I wasn't imagining the pattern. I never thought I'd actually hand them to anyone. Torres reached for the folder with the careful reverence of someone accepting a gift they'd waited years for. Mr. Gray, she said quietly, this might be the single most important piece of evidence I've collected in 2 years on this case. Don't thank me yet, Mason said, some of his old courtroom sharpness returning to his voice for the first time in the conversation. Because the second Harold Hale finds out I handed this over, my daughter's fiancé isn't the only person in my life who's going to have a very bad week. You need to move fast and you need to move quiet because that man has ears in places you haven't even thought to check yet. By the time Jack and Torres returned to Mercy Ridge that evening, the atmosphere on the 3rd floor had shifted in a way that made Jack's stomach tighten the moment he stepped off the elevator. Tank was pacing outside Lena's room, jaw tight, and Preacher stood with his arms crossed watching 2 men in suits, not police, not hospital staff, arguing quietly with a nurse near the desk. What happened? Jack said, more demand than question. Lawyers, Tank said. Victor's lawyers. Showed up an hour ago with paperwork for an emergency custody hearing, trying to get it moved up before the baby's even born. Something about establishing guardianship intent in advance given, and I quote, the mother's demonstrated instability and the father's documented concern for the child's welfare. Jack's hands curled into fists. He's trying to get ahead of the birth. Whitfield already ran them off once. Tank said, but they're not going anywhere. They've got a hearing filed for Thursday. 2 days from now. Jack pushed past them into Lena's room, where he found her sitting up, color returning slightly to her face, but her expression tight with barely restrained panic. A stack of legal papers on the bed beside her that a process server had apparently delivered less than an hour earlier. They're trying to take her before she's even born, Lena said, voice shaking with fury rather than fear. Now a distinction Jack noted with something like relief. Look at this demonstrated maternal instability, citing a psychiatric history I don't even have. He's making it up, Jack, and he's got some doctor's signature on here I've never met in my life. Let me see that. Jack scanned the document, his jaw tightening with every line. Dr. Elias Kramer, you know that name? Never heard of him. I have, Torres said grimly, stepping into the room behind Jack. Kramer's a psychiatrist who's provided expert testimony in at least 4 cases connected to Hale family interests over the past decade. Every single time his evaluation happened to align perfectly with whatever outcome benefited Judge Hale's associates. I've had my eye on him for months, but nobody's ever formally complained. Well, I'm complaining, Lena said sharply. That man has never examined me, never spoken to me. He can't legally submit a psychiatric evaluation on a patient he's never met. He can if nobody challenges it fast enough, And hearings like this move quickly when a judge wants them to, Torres said. Thursday doesn't give us much time, but it's not nothing. I need Mason Gray's documentation formally entered as supporting evidence. I need a legitimate psychiatric evaluation on record from Dr. Whitfield's team, contradicting Kramer's fraudulent one. And I need you, she looked directly at Lena, prepared to testify in front of a judge who is going to be handpicked by people who want you to fail. I can do that, Lena said immediately, though something flickered behind her eyes. The memory, perhaps, of every time in the past 7 months she'd told herself she could handle Victor and been wrong. There's something else, Torres said, hesitating for the first time since Jack had met her. The judge assigned to Thursday's hearing. It's not Harold Hale himself, obviously. Conflict of interest rules would never allow that. It's a judge named Patricia Voss. Mason Gray, who had insisted on coming along despite his bad knee and worse nerves, made a sound low in his throat somewhere between a groan and a curse. Voss, he said. She's been on the bench 11 years. Every single one of those years, she's ruled favorably on cases connected to Harold Hale's interests. Not every time, obviously, that would look suspicious, even by this county's low standards, but enough times at exactly the right moments that nobody serious believes it's coincidence. Then we needed something Voss can't rule around, Torres said. Something so airtight, so undeniable, that even a compromised judge would risk her own career ruling against the evidence. The room fell into a heavy, calculating silence. 5 people staring at the weight of an impossible timeline. 2 days to build a case strong enough to survive a rigged courtroom against a family that had spent 30 years making sure nothing ever survived them. There's one thing, Lena said slowly, and every eye in the room turned toward her. The car. The one Victor was driving that night. He reported it stolen the same night, didn't he? Which means it's somewhere impounded, recovered something. If the brake lines were cut, if there's any physical evidence in that vehicle proving this wasn't an accident, that's exactly the kind of hard evidence that could break this case wide open, Torres said, already reaching for her phone. A stolen vehicle report filed hours after an assault on the same vehicle used in the assault. That's not just suspicious, that's a paper trail leading directly back to Victor, covering his tracks. If I can get to that car before it's processed and quietly returned or scrapped, then we need to move tonight, Jack said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Every hour we wait is another hour. Harold Hale has to make sure that evidence disappears the same way Rebecca did. Torres was already dialing, already barking coordinates and case numbers into her phone with the clipped urgency of someone who understood exactly how thin this window had become. And outside the window of Lena's hospital room, the last light of day was bleeding out over the county, leaving behind a darkness that Jack Ryder understood with total clarity was about to become a race against a clock that Harold Hale controlled far better than any of them. Agent Torres, the nurse's voice called suddenly from the hallway, sharp with urgency that made everyone in the room go still. You need to see this. It's the front desk. Someone's asking for, Mrs. Carter says he's her legal counsel, and he's got Judge Voss's clerk on the phone confirming the custody hearing's been moved up. Moved up to when? Torres demanded. The nurse's face was pale. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. The silence that followed was absolute. 5 people staring at each other across a hospital room, understanding in the same terrible instant that whatever window they thought they had just slammed shut 18 hours ahead of schedule, and somewhere across town in an office with a view of the courthouse, he'd spent 30 years building into his personal kingdom. Harold Hale allowed himself, for the first time since the storm, a small, satisfied smile. 9 a.m. tomorrow. 12 hours, maybe less, before Lena Carter would have to stand in front of a judge who'd spent 11 years ruling in Harold Hale's favor. And somewhere in that same span of hours, Rachel Torres needed to find a stolen vehicle before it vanished the way Rebecca Hale had vanished 6 years earlier. I need that impound lot address, Torres said into her phone, already moving toward the door, badge in hand. Sheriff's Department County lot, wherever a reported stolen vehicle would sit while it's processed. Now, not in an hour. They'll have people watching that lot, Mason Gray said from his chair, voice hoarse with old fear resurfacing. If Harold's smart enough to move the hearing up 18 hours, he's smart enough to have already sent someone to make sure that car doesn't say anything. It shouldn't. Then we're already behind, Jack said, grabbing his jacket off the back of the chair, which means we stop talking and start moving. Lena reached out and caught his sleeve before he could turn away, her grip weak but insistent. Jack, if Victor finds out you're the one digging up that car, he's not going to come after evidence next time. He's going to come after you. Let him try, Jack said, and something in the flatness of his voice told her he meant it with the same certainty he'd meant every promise since the ravine. I'm serious, Lena pressed. You don't know what these people are capable of. I do. I lived it for 2 years and I still almost died believing they had limits. Jack crouched slightly so he was eye level with her voice dropping into something quieter, steadier. Lena, I buried a brother because I was too young and too broke to fight men like this the right way. I've spent 15 years since then getting older, getting smarter, building something with 60 brothers who'd walk into fire if I asked them to. I am not the same man who lost that fight the first time. Let me do this. She held his gaze a long moment, then nodded, releasing his sleeve. The county impound lot sat behind a chain-link fence on the industrial edge of town, floodlit and mostly empty. At this hour, a single board attendant manning a booth that smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Torres flashed her badge before the man could even finish his sentence. FBI, I need to see a vehicle logged in tonight, reported stolen, registered to a Victor Hale. The attendant, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a name tag that read Gus, blinked slowly, processing the badge, the late hour, and the presence of Jack Ryder looming a few feet behind her like a mountain that had decided to grow legs. Vehicle like that came in a few hours back, Gus said slowly. But I got a call not 20 minutes ago saying it's already been released. Insurance company rep came and picked it up personal, like said the owner needed it back fast on account of the theft report and all. Torres's jaw tightened. Show me the release paperwork. Gus shuffled through a clipboard, and when he found the page, his frown deepened. That's funny, he muttered. Says here it was released to an insurance adjuster named, hang on, Kramer. E. Kramer. Jack and Torres exchanged a look sharp enough to cut glass. That's the same name on the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, Torres said, already dialing dispatch. Elias Kramer isn't an insurance adjuster. He's Harold Hale's hired psychiatrist, and he just personally collected the one piece of physical evidence that could prove Victor sabotaged that car. Which way did he go? Jack demanded. Gus, sensing now that something considerably larger than a routine vehicle release was unfolding in front of him, pointed a shaking finger toward the exit gate. Maybe 15 minutes ago, said something about a garage over on Route 12 private lot, said the insurance company wanted it inspected there instead of the county shop. Route 12, Jack repeated, already moving toward his bike. That's not an insurance garage. That's Hale property. His father owns a repair shop out there under some shell company has for years. Jack, Torres started, but he was already swinging his leg over the Harley engine, roaring to life before she could finish the sentence. I'll follow, she shouted over the noise, sprinting for her car. Don't do anything that gets you arrested before I get there. Route 12 cut through farmland, gone dark and empty at this hour, and Jack Ryder rode it like a man chasing the last 15 years of his life, headlight cutting a narrow tunnel through the black. Behind him, he heard the low thunder of two more engines, Tank and Preacher, who'd peeled off the moment they heard where Jack was headed, unwilling to let him ride into Hale territory alone, no matter what argument he might have made against it. The garage came into view a mile out, a squat metal building with two bay doors. One already rolled halfway up, lights spilling out onto a gravel lot where a tow truck sat with Victor's wrecked sedan still chained to its bed. Jack cut his engine 100 yards out and coasted the rest of the way, in silence, Tank and Preacher doing the same behind him. Through the open bay door, they could see a man in a lab coat, incongruous, absurd, a costume of legitimacy, crouched beside the car's front wheel, well with a flashlight and a small toolkit, working with the careful, unhurried precision of someone erasing evidence rather than documenting it. That's Kramer, Jack murmured. Doctor by day, apparently a mechanic by night, when Harold Hale needs something disappeared. What's he doing to the car? Tank whispered. Making sure nobody ever proves those brake lines were cut, Jack said grimly and stepped forward into the light of the bay door. Little late for an insurance inspection, isn't it, Doc? Kramer startled so hard he dropped his flashlight, the beam rolling and throwing crazy shadows across the garage walls as he spun to face three large men in leather cutting off his exit. This is private property, Kramer stammered, recovering some composure. You have no right to be here. Neither do you, seeing as this isn't an insurance garage, Jack said, stepping closer. Close enough to see the tool in Kramer's hand, a small cutting implement precisely the kind that could turn a suspicious clean break into an ambiguous ragged one that no mechanic could definitively call sabotage. What exactly are you fixing on a car that's supposed to be evidence in a federal investigation? I don't know what you're talking about. Save it, came Torres's voice from behind them. Badge already raised as she stepped through the bay door with two local officers she'd apparently flagged down, en route lights flashing outside on the gravel lot. Elias Kramer, step away from that vehicle right now. This car is the subject of an active federal investigation, and what you're doing right now is evidence tampering, which is a felony that's going to sit very nicely on top of the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation you already filed in family court. Kramer's face went the color of old paper. I was hired by the insurance company. There is no insurance company, Torres said, snatching the paperwork from the tow truck's dashboard. This release form lists a company that dissolved 4 years ago. You're going to want a lawyer, doctor, and I'd start thinking hard about whether that lawyer works for you or for Harold Hale, because those are about to become very different interests. One of the local officers moved to cuff Kramer, who was sputtering protests that grew weaker with every word, and Torres crouched beside the wheel well he'd been working on, examining the brake line with careful eyes. He didn't get to finish, she said after a moment, relief cutting through the tension in her voice. The cut's still visible. Clean, deliberate. This wasn't wear and tear. This wasn't corrosion. Somebody took tools to this line on purpose. She looked up at Jack. This is it. This is the physical evidence that turns he said, she said into an actual crime scene. Jack felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since the moment he'd pulled Lena out of that ravine. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first real foothold in a fight he'd started to believe might be unwinnable. Get it processed tonight, he said, before the sun comes up and Harold Hale figures out a new way to make this disappear. By the time Jack made it back to Mercy Ridge, dawn was just beginning to gray the edges of the sky, and he found Lena awake, sitting up, watching the door, with the particular tension of someone who'd spent the last several hours imagining every possible way the night could have gone wrong. You're bleeding, she said the instant she saw him, eyes catching on a shallow scrape along his knuckles he hadn't even noticed. Gravel, Jack said. Nothing serious. He pulled the chair close to her bed and sat, exhaustion finally catching up to him in the slump of his shoulders. We got the car, Lena. Torres has the brake line. It's evidence now, real evidence, the kind that doesn't disappear just because Harold Hale wants it to. Lena's hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment Jack thought she might cry, but instead a fierce, disbelieving laugh broke loose. Instead, half sob, half something like hope, finally daring to surface after 2 years of being systematically strangled out of her. He's going to lose his mind, she said. Victor, when he finds out Kramer got caught, when he realizes the car's real, he's going to lose his mind. Let him, Jack said. A man who loses his mind makes mistakes. We need him to make mistakes. The door opened and Torres stepped in, looking like she'd aged 5 years overnight, but carrying herself with the sharp focus of someone who'd just found the first crack in a 30-year wall. Forensics is processing the brake line as we speak, she said. I've also got Mason Gray's documentation formally logged, and I spent the drive back on the phone with my supervisor. We're elevating this. What started as a possible domestic assault case is now looking at federal racketeering charges against Judge Hale himself, obstruction of justice, evidence, tampering, conspiracy. This is no longer just about Victor. What about the hearing? Lena asked, and Jack could hear the fear threading back into her voice. The one thing this good news hadn't managed to fully erase. 9 a.m., that's what, 3 hours from now. Torres' expression sobered. The hearing's still on the books. I can't unilaterally stop a state family court proceeding, not with the evidence I have. Right this second, not fast enough. What I can do is walk into that courtroom with you and make sure Judge Voss understands exactly what's happening in the federal case running parallel to hers. Sometimes that's enough to give even a compromised judge pause. Sometimes it's not. That's not exactly reassuring, Lena said. I'm not in the business of false reassurance, Mrs. Carter, Torres said. I'm in the business of telling you the truth so you can prepare for whatever happens next. And the truth is, this morning is going to be a fight, and I need you strong enough to fight it. So, the county courthouse rose up out of the early morning fog like something built to intimidate, rather than to serve all gray stone and imposing columns. And Lena Carter walked up its front steps at 8:45 that morning, leaning on a cane the hospital had provided for her sprained ankle, flanked on one side by Jack Ryder, and on the other by Rachel Torres, with Mason Gray trailing a few steps behind, clutching his precious folder of evidence like a man carrying his own redemption. Behind them, parked in a neat, deliberate row along the curb outside the courthouse, sat 11 Harleys. Their riders standing in a loose formation that wasn't quite a wall and wasn't quite a threat, but was unmistakably, undeniably a presence that every person walking into that building that morning would have to notice. "You didn't have to do this," Lena murmured to Jack as they climbed the steps. "The bikes, all of them lined up like that." "I know," Jack said simply, "but you walk into that courtroom alone. Victor's lawyers paint you as some fragile, isolated woman with no one in her corner but a story nobody wants to believe. You walk in with an army behind you. Even if that army never says a word inside those doors, it changes the story they can tell about you." Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Lena had expected. Wood-paneled and hushed, and Victor was already seated at the opposing table beside two lawyers in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His face arranged into a mask of wounded concern the moment he spotted her entering. "Lena," he said softly, standing as if to approach her, stopped only by his own attorney's hand on his arm. "You look like you've been through hell. I've been so worried." "Save it," Lena said, voice steadier than she felt, and took her seat at the opposing table beside her own newly appointed attorney, a young public defender named Sarah Kim, who'd been assigned the case only hours earlier and looked simultaneously terrified and determined to rise to the occasion. Judge Patricia Voss entered a few minutes later, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair, pulled back severely, and eyes that gave away absolutely nothing, and the room rose and settled in the particular hush of institutional formality. "This is an emergency hearing regarding temporary custody arrangements for an unborn child," Voss began, voice flat and procedural. "Given the circumstances of the mother's recent hospitalization and documented concerns regarding her psychological stability, the petitioner is requesting the court establish guardianship provisions in advance of the child's birth." "Your Honor," Sarah Kim said, rising immediately, "the psychiatric evaluation cited in this petition was conducted by Dr. Elias Kramer, who was arrested less than 4 hours ago on charges of evidence tampering in a related federal investigation. Dr. Kramer never examined my client. His evaluation is fraudulent on its face." A murmur rippled through the small gallery. Victor's lawyer rose smoothly, unbothered. "Your Honor, my client's petition doesn't rest solely on Dr. Kramer's evaluation. There are additional concerns regarding Mrs. Carter's documented history of erratic behavior, including an incident just 2 nights ago in which she threw herself from a moving vehicle." Victor's lawyer continued, and Lena's stomach dropped, even though she'd known this was coming, had braced for it in every hour of sleepless preparation, and still felt the words land like a physical blow. "A vehicle my client was driving. She became agitated during an argument, opened the door herself, and despite my client's attempts to stop her, fell from the car onto the roadside." "That is a lie," Lena said, rising before Sarah could stop, her voice cracking with fury rather than fear now. "Mrs. Carter, please remain seated unless addressed by the court," Voss said sharply, though something flickered behind her eyes. Irritation perhaps at the interruption, or something else entirely that Lena couldn't yet read. "Your Honor," Torres said, rising from the gallery with the calm authority of someone who'd spent years learning exactly when to insert herself into a room's momentum. "I'm Special Agent Rachel Torres, FBI. I'd like to enter into evidence the results of a forensic examination completed early this morning on the vehicle in question, which shows deliberate mechanical tampering with the brake line consistent with an attempt to disable the vehicle's stopping capability. This evidence directly contradicts the petitioner's version of events and is currently part of an active federal investigation into obstruction of justice connected to this family." The courtroom went utterly silent. Victor's face, Lena noted with grim satisfaction, had gone the color of chalk. "That evidence is not properly before this court," Victor's lawyer said quickly, recovering. "This is a family court proceeding regarding custody, not a criminal trial. This court is entitled to consider evidence directly relevant to the credibility of statements made by both parties," Torres said. "And I'd remind the court that obstructing a federal investigation, which Dr. Kramer has already been charged with this morning, casts significant doubt on any evaluation or testimony connected to him or the family that engaged his services." Judge Voss's expression remained carefully neutral, but Lena watched her eyes flick almost imperceptibly toward the gallery, toward the row of leather-clad men filling the back benches, toward the presence of a federal agent standing in her courtroom on a case she'd clearly expected to be a quiet, uncontested formality. I'll need time to review this forensic report properly before making any custody determinations, Voss said finally, and something in her tone had shifted, some calculation rearranging itself behind her composed exterior. This hearing is continued until such time as the federal investigation's relevant findings can be formally submitted and reviewed. In the meantime, given the serious and credible allegations of evidence tampering connected to the petitioner's case, I am not prepared to grant any temporary custody provisions today. Victor shot up from his chair. Your Honor, that's my ruling, Mr. Hale, Voss said sharply, gavel already coming down. This hearing is adjourned. The gallery erupted into murmured case, and Lena sat frozen for a moment, disbelieving, as Sarah Kim turned to her with something like stunned relief on her young face. We won, Sarah whispered. Not permanently, but we won today. Lena felt Jack's hand find her shoulder from where he'd been standing at the gallery rail. And when she looked up at him, she found something in his eyes that mirrored the fragile, disbelieving hope blooming in her own chest. One round, Jack murmured, but it's a start. Victor didn't wait to leave the courthouse with any pretense of composure this time. He shoved past his own lawyers in the hallway outside, phone already pressed to his ear, voice a low, venomous hiss. You told me Voss would rule in our favor no matter what, he snarled into the phone. You told me this was handled. On the other end, Harold Hale's voice remained maddeningly calm, the voice of a man recalculating rather than panicking. Kramer's arrest was not part of the plan, Victor. That complicates things. Complicates things, Dad. There's a federal agent in there talking about racketeering, about the brake line, about... Victor's voice dropped to a strangled whisper as he ducked into an empty side hallway. How did they even find that car? I thought you said the impound lot was handled. It was handled until your bikers decided to play detective, Harold said coldly. This Jack Ryder character is proving to be more of a persistent irritation than I anticipated. Victor's eyes narrowed at the name, something ugly and personal sparking behind them. Ryder, that's the one who confronted me at the hospital, said Lena told him everything on the ride over. I'm aware of who he is, Harold said. I've had someone pull his file already. Former felony assault charge 22 years ago, pled down to a misdemeanor. President of the local Hells Angels chapter for over a decade. And Harold's voice took on a note of something that might have almost been satisfaction. His brother Daniel Ryder was convicted in my courtroom 15 years ago on a manslaughter charge. Died in prison 8 years into his sentence. Victor went quiet for a moment, processing. You think this is personal for him? Not really about Lena at all. I think, Harold said, that Jack Ryder has been waiting 15 years for an opportunity to settle a score with his family, and your wife's little accident handed it to him gift-wrapped. Which means he's not going to stop Victor, not for money, not for threats, not for anything, short of losing everything he's built protecting her. Men motivated by old grief are the most dangerous kind. They have got nothing left to lose and everything to prove. So what do? We find his weakness, Harold said simply. Every man has one. Ryder's isn't money, and it clearly isn't fear for himself. So we look at his club, his brothers, the people he's responsible for. A man like that will burn himself down to protect his own before he'll ever let harm come to them, which means if we can't stop him directly, we make him choose between protecting Lena Carter and protecting the 60 men who call him president. That afternoon, back at the clubhouse, a converted warehouse on the edge of town that had served as the chapter's headquarters for over a decade, Jack called an emergency meeting. Every patch member gathered around the long, scarred table in the main room, the mood tense with the particular electricity of men who understood they'd stepped into something far larger than a simple act of roadside charity. I want to be straight with everybody here, Jack said, standing at the head of the table, hands braced against the wood. What we pulled out of that ravine 2 nights ago wasn't just a rescue. It's turned into a direct confrontation with Harold Hale, a man who's spent 30 years controlling every court, every cop, every piece of leverage in this county. That means from here forward, every one of you is a target too, whether you want to be or not. We already knew that when we rode out to that garage last night, Preacher said. Ain't nobody in this room walking away now. I need to hear that from every man individually, Jack said, because Harold Hale doesn't fight fair and he doesn't fight alone. He's got money. He's got the courts. He's got people willing to do ugly things quietly. If any of you have families, kids' jobs that can't survive this kind of heat, I need you to say so now, and there will be no shame in stepping back." The room was silent for a long moment, and then Tank stood arms crossed. "Jack, I watched you pull a half-dead pregnant woman out of a ditch with your bare hands 2 nights ago because it was the right thing to do. No hesitation, no calculation. Ain't a man in this room who's forgotten what this patch is supposed to mean. We're not stepping back." One by one, every man around that table voiced the same sentiment until Jack finally nodded, something heavy and grateful settling in his chest. "Then here's where we stand," he said. "Torres is building a federal case that's about to blow this county's corruption wide open. Mason Gray's evidence, the brake line, Kramer's arrest, it's all pointing towards something bigger than Victor Hale ever imagined getting caught up in. But Harold's already adapting. He's smart and he's dangerous, and he's not going to sit back and let this happen without a fight." "What do you need from us?" Diesel asked. "Eyes," Jack said, "on the hospital round the clock until Lena delivers that baby. On Mason Gray, because that man just handed over evidence that makes him the single most vulnerable witness in this entire case. And on ourselves, Harold already knows my history with this family. He's going to come at me personally before this is over, and I need every one of you watching each other's backs, because that's exactly the kind of pressure point a man like him knows how to exploit." That evening, as the sun dipped low over Mercy Ridge Hospital, Lena sat propped up in bed watching the parking lot below through her window, where the familiar shapes of 2 Harleys sat parked in the shadow of the building, a quiet, constant vigil that had become as steady as her own heartbeat over the past 2 days. Jack found her there when he came to check on her, and something in her expression made him pause in the doorway. "You okay?" "I keep thinking about her," Lena said quietly. "Rebecca, Victor's first wife, locked away in some facility for 6 years because she tried to leave, because she tried to tell the truth and nobody believed her enough to stop it." She looked up at Jack, eyes glistening. "That could have been me. That would have been me if you hadn't found me in that ravine." "But it wasn't," Jack said, settling into the familiar chair beside her bed. "And it's not going to be. We're going to get her out too. Once this case builds enough momentum, once Harold Hale's whole operation starts collapsing, Rebecca's commitment is going to look exactly like what it was, another cover-up, another woman silenced because she refused to disappear quietly." "You really believe that? That this can actually work, that men like Harold Hale actually fall?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, thinking of his brother's grave 2 counties over, of 15 years of grief he'd carried like a stone in his chest, of the strange, unexpected mercy of a stormy night that had put him on that exact stretch of road at exactly the right moment to hear a stranger scream for help. "I think," he said finally, "that for 30 years nobody stood in front of Harold Hale and refused to move. I think that's about to change. And I think you, Lena Carter, are the reason it's finally changing." Outside, dusk deepened into full dark, and somewhere across town in his study, lined with law books and framed photographs of a career built on carefully cultivated fear, Judge Harold Hale sat with a glass of scotch untouched at his elbow, staring at a phone he'd just used to place a call that would set in motion the most dangerous night this fight had seen, yet a call to a man whose name never appeared on any official record, whose only job for the past 20 years had been making problems disappear permanently. Long before they ever reached a courtroom, a federal agent, or a folder of carefully preserved evidence. "There's a situation that requires a more direct solution," Harold said quietly into the receiver, watching the ice slowly melt in his abandoned drink. "A biker, an FBI agent, and a disbarred lawyer, all conveniently located within a few miles of each other. I want this handled before the week is out. Quietly, permanently, and I want it to look like exactly the kind of accident men in that lifestyle are prone to having." The call Harold Hale made that night didn't go through official channels, didn't leave a single trace in any court filing or police log, and by the time the sun rose over Mercy Ridge Hospital the next morning, a man named Wade Collins had already parked a rented sedan 2 blocks from the clubhouse, watching the comings and goings of Jack Ryder's chapter with the patient. Clinical attention of someone who'd made a career out of disappearing problems for men who could afford to make problems disappear. Jack didn't know any of that yet. He only knew that Lena had made it through another night, that Torres had called at dawn to say the federal case was accelerating faster than she'd dared hope, and that for the first time in 3 days, something like cautious optimism had crept into the air around Mercy Ridge's 3rd floor. Kramer's talking. Torres said meeting Jack and Tank in the hospital cafeteria over coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration. Turns out facing federal evidence tampering charges makes a man remarkably eager to cooperate. He's naming names describing a system that goes back at least a decade, falsified evaluations, buried evidence. At least 3 other women besides Rebecca Hale who got quietly institutionalized right before they could testify against someone connected to the Hale family. 3 more. Jack repeated, something cold settling in his stomach. 3 more Rebeccas. At minimum, Torres said grimly, I've got agents pulling records on all 3 cases as we speak. If even half of what Kramer's describing holds up, we're not looking at a simple obstruction charge anymore. We're looking at a RICO case that could take down half the county courthouse. What about Harold? Tank asked. He's got to know Kramer's cooperating by now. He knows, Torres confirmed, which is exactly why I need everyone connected to this case to be extra careful over the next few days. Cornered men do desperate things, and Harold Hale has spent 30 years never once being cornered. He doesn't know how to lose gracefully because he's never had to. Jack's phone buzzed against the table and he glanced down to see Mason Gray's name flash across the screen, the old lawyer's voice tight with barely controlled panic the moment Jack answered. Jack, I need you to listen to me carefully, Mason said. There was a car outside my office all night. Same sedan parked 2 spots down, engine never turned off for more than 20 minutes at a time. I don't like it. I've seen this kind of watching before back when I still practiced right before things went bad for people who crossed the wrong family. Stay inside, Jack said immediately, standing up so fast his chair scraped loud against the cafeteria floor. Lock your doors. Don't answer for anybody you don't recognize. I'm sending Diesel and Preacher over right now. Jack, I mean it, Mason, stay put. He hung up and turned to Torres, whose expression had already shifted into something sharper, more alert. Someone's watching Mason Gray's office. That tracks with something else I just got flagged, Torres said, pulling out her phone. Traffic camera footage from 3 intersections near the courthouse picked up the same sedan circling multiple times over the past 18 hours. I ran the plates an hour ago, rental car paid in cash under a name that doesn't match any ID on file with the rental company. That's not sloppy. That's professional. Professional like what? Tank asked, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. Professional like someone Harold Hale hired because his usual tools, judges, lawyers, corrupt cops, have stopped being enough to solve his problem. Torres said, I need everyone connected to this case moving in pairs from now on. No exceptions. Not you, not Mason, not Lena, and especially not you, Jack, given what we both know about your personal history with this family. Tattoo. Jack dispatched Diesel and Preacher to Mason's office within minutes, and by the time they arrived, the sedan had vanished from its parking spot, leaving no trace but a faint oil stain on the asphalt, and Mason Gray standing at his window, pale and shaking, staring at the empty space where a stranger had watched him for the better part of a day. He's gone, Mason told them the moment they walked through his door. Whoever it was, gone the second your bikes turned onto the street. That's not comforting, Preacher said. Means he's watching close enough to know exactly when to disappear. Mason sank into his desk chair, hands trembling slightly as he reached for the bourbon bottle before catching himself and pushing it away again, a small gesture that told Diesel more about the old lawyer's fear than any words could have. I spent 30 years watching Harold Hale ruin people who got too close to the truth, Mason said quietly. I never thought I'd end up back in the crosshairs. Foolish of me, I suppose, handing over that folder like I was some kind of hero instead of a scared old man who should have known better. You did the right thing, Diesel said firmly, and now we're going to make sure you get to keep breathing long enough to see it matter. By early afternoon, Jack had made his way back to the hospital, restless, with the particular anxious energy of a man who understood a threat was circling but couldn't yet see its shape clearly enough to fight it directly. He found Lena sitting up in bed, color fuller in her cheeks than it had been in days, one hand resting protectively over the swell of her stomach. You look like a man carrying the weight of the entire county on his shoulders, she said as he settled into the now familiar chair beside her bed. Somebody's watching Mason Gray's office, Jack admitted. There was no point lying to her anymore, not after everything they had already survived together. Professional, careful. Torres thinks Harold's hired outside help now that his usual methods have stopped working. Lena's hand tightened over her belly, an instinctive protective motion, Jack had come to recognize as her body's response to fear before her mind even caught up to processing it consciously. He's escalating, she said quietly. That's what this means, isn't it? Every time we push back, he pushes back harder. That's usually how cornered men behave, Jack admitted. But it also means we're winning Lena. A man with nothing to lose doesn't escalate, he surrenders. Harold's escalating because for the first time in 30 years, he's actually scared of losing something. That doesn't make me feel safer. I'm not trying to make you feel safer, Jack said honestly. I'm trying to make sure you understand exactly what we're up against because pretending otherwise doesn't protect you. It just leaves you unprepared. Lena studied him for a long moment, something soft flickering behind her exhaustion. You know, most people would have walked away by now, pulled me out of that ravine, called it a good deed gone back to their lives. You've stayed for 3 days straight, fought lawyers and judges and hired watchers, put your entire club at risk. Why, Jack was quiet, turning the question over the way he had the first night in the hospital, deciding again how much of himself to give away. Because somewhere along the way, he said, finally, this stopped being about you or about Danny or about settling an old score. It became about whether men like Harold Hale get to keep deciding who matters in this county and who doesn't. I've spent 15 years believing that fight was already lost. I'm not walking away from the first real chance I've had to prove myself wrong. The confrontation everyone had been quietly bracing for finally arrived 2 days later on a gray, overcast afternoon that felt heavy with the particular pressure of weather about to break. Jack had gone to the hospital's parking garage to move his bike out of a spot the hospital administration had politely but firmly requested he vacate, and he was crouched beside the Harley checking a loose bolt when Victor Hale's voice cut through the concrete silence behind him. You've ruined my life, you know that. Jack didn't turn around right away, finishing the bolt with deliberate calm before rising to his full height and facing the man who'd thrown his pregnant wife out of a moving car 3 days earlier. Your life was ruined the second you opened that car door, Jack said. I just made sure everyone found out about it. Victor's face contorted the polished, grieving husband mask, finally cracking entirely to reveal something raw and ugly underneath. You don't understand what you've started. My father built this county. He's going to bury you and every single one of your degenerate friends, and there's not going to be a court in this state willing to stop him. Funny, Jack said. Your father seems a lot less confident than you do right now, seeing as he's hiring people to sit outside a disbarred lawyer's office instead of just walking into a courtroom and winning like he always claims he can. Something flickered across Victor's face. Surprise quickly masked that Jack already knew about the watcher outside Mason's office. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you don't. Jack took a step closer, close enough that Victor visibly resisted the urge to retreat. Let me give you some free advice, son. Men like your father, men who've never lost anything because they've spent 30 years rigging every game before it starts, they forget how to actually fight when the rigging stops working. You're watching that happen right now. Every move you make just digs the hole deeper. You think you're some kind of hero, Victor spat. You're a criminal, a biker. Everybody in this county knows exactly what your patch means, and no jury is ever going to take the word of a gang member over a respected family. We'll see, Jack said calmly. Federal juries tend to care more about brake lines and forensic evidence than they do about leather jackets. Victor's control finally snapped entirely. He shoved Jack hard in the chest, a stupid, desperate act of a cornered man with nothing left but his own physical frustration, and Jack caught off guard, more by the audacity than the force, stumbled back half a step before catching his balance. What happened next unfolded in less than 4 seconds, but it would take weeks to fully unravel the consequences. Jack's instinct, honed by 4 decades of bar fights and roadside confrontations, was to shove back, not to strike, not to escalate into real violence, just to create distance, to push Victor away and end the confrontation before it went somewhere neither of them could take back. His open palm connected with Victor's shoulder, sending him stumbling backward into the side of a parked car, hard enough to leave a small dent in the door panel and a bruise that would bloom purple across Victor's shoulder blade within the hour. It was by any reasonable measure a minor scuffle. It was also, Jack realized with sinking dread, half a second too late, exactly what someone standing behind a security camera 30 feet away had been hoping to capture. Security! Victor screamed immediately, clutching at his shoulder with theatrical agony that suggested he'd broken something considerably more fragile than a car door panel had actually done. He assaulted me. Somebody called the police. This man just assaulted me. You put your hands on me first, Jack said, disbelief coloring his voice, as two hospital security guards came jogging around the corner, drawn by Victor's shouting. There's a camera right there. It'll show exactly what happened. But even as Jack said it, some cold sinking part of him already understood the trap he'd walked into. Because cameras could be reviewed selectively. Footage could be edited, delayed, mishandled by people who owed favors to a judge who'd controlled this county's institutions for 30 years. And in the meantime, all that mattered to the two security guards now approaching with hands on their radios was that a large man in a leather cut had apparently just shoved a well-dressed local businessman hard enough to dent a car door. Sir, I need you to step away and keep your hands where I can see them, one guard said, already reaching for his radio. This man threatened me. Victor continued playing the moment for everything it was worth, tears somehow summoned on command. He's been threatening my family for days, harassing my wife's medical team, and now he's assaulted me on hospital property. That's a lie, Jack said, but he could feel the situation calcifying around him with terrible speed. The way these things always did when the story got told first by the person with more polish and less honesty. He shoved me first, asked the camera. Within 10 minutes, two police officers arrived, not Delgado and Ruiz this time, but a pair Jack didn't recognize, moving with the brisk efficiency of men who'd clearly been briefed on exactly what story they were meant to find waiting for them. Sir, we're going to need you to come with us, the lead officer said, already reaching for handcuffs. You're arresting me based on his word alone, Jack said, voice rising with the first genuine flash of alarm he'd allowed himself since this entire ordeal began. There's security footage. Pull the footage. Footage will be reviewed as part of the investigation, the officer said in the flat, rehearsed tone of a man reciting a line rather than genuinely committing to it. Right now, we have a witness reporting an assault and visible injury to the alleged victim. Turn around, please, hands behind your back. Jack's mind raced through options in the half-second before the cuffs closed around his wrist. Resist and confirm every ugly assumption anyone had ever made about men who wore his patch or comply, and trust a system he had spent 15 years believing was fundamentally broken beyond repair. He thought of Lena, 3 floors above them, 31 weeks pregnant, and finally beginning to believe someone might actually protect her. He thought of what it would mean if he lost control, now gave Victor exactly the narrative he needed, the violent biker, the criminal element, the dangerous ally, who justified everything. Judge Hale's lawyers would eventually argue about Lena's credibility for trusting men like this in the first place. Okay, Jack said quietly and turned around, offering his wrist without another word of protest. Okay, take me in. The news reached Lena within the hour, delivered by a visibly shaken Tank, who'd witnessed enough of the aftermath in the parking garage to piece together most of what had happened. They arrested him, Lena said, disbelief giving way rapidly to fury, for defending himself against a man who assaulted him first. Security footage should clear it up, Tank said, though his voice carried none of the confidence the words were meant to convey. Torres is already on it, trying to get the footage pulled before anybody has a chance to lose it or edit it. Lose it, Lena repeated bitterly. You mean the way evidence in this county has a habit of disappearing whenever it's inconvenient for the Hale family? Jack knew what he was doing when he let them cuff him, Tank said. He could have fought it, could have made it worse. He chose not to because he knew exactly what story Victor was trying to build, and he wasn't going to hand it to him for free. Lena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything Jack had sacrificed pressing down on her chest alongside her own fears. This is my fault. If I hadn't survived that ravine, if he hadn't stopped. Don't you dare finish that sentence, Tank said, sharper than she'd ever heard him speak to her. Jack made his choice the second he saw you in that ditch, and he'd make the exact same choice again right now if you asked him. This isn't your fault. It's Harold Hale's and Victor's and nobody else's. Jack sat in a holding cell that smelled of bleach and old sweat, staring at a concrete wall running through the parking garage confrontation over and over in his mind, searching for the moment he could have handled differently and finding none that wouldn't have played directly into Victor's hands one way or another. A guard eventually escorted him to a small interview room where Torres was waiting, expression tight with barely contained frustration. They're charging you with assault, she said without preamble. I've requested the security footage 3 times in the last 2 hours. Each time I'm told it's being reviewed or temporarily unavailable due to a system malfunction. Convenient malfunction, Jack said flatly. Extremely. Tora sat across from him, rubbing her temples. Jack, I need you to understand something. This arrest, even if we eventually clear you, buys Harold Hale time and leverage he desperately needed. It paints you as violent and unstable right when the custody case is heating back up. It gives Victor's lawyers ammunition to argue that Lena's entire support system consists of dangerous criminals. And worst of all, it takes you out of that hospital right when she needs you most. I know exactly what it does, Jack said quietly. I let it happen anyway because the alternative was fighting back in that parking garage and giving Victor an actual assault charge that would have stuck a hell of a lot better than whatever manufactured nonsense he's spinning right now. There's something else, Torres said, hesitating in a way that immediately put Jack on alert. Mason Gray's office was broken into an hour ago. Nothing appears to have been taken based on his initial assessment, but his files were disturbed. Someone went through his cabinets, specifically the drawers where he kept his original documentation, before he handed the copies over to me. Jack's jaw tightened. Is he okay? Shaken but unharmed. He wasn't there when it happened. But it's clear now whoever's been watching him decided to make a move the moment they knew you were locked up and unable to respond. Torres leaned forward. This is coordinated, Jack. Your arrest, the break-in, it happened within the same 2-hour window. Harold Hale is moving fast, trying to dismantle everything we built while you're sitting in a cell unable to do anything about it. Then get me out of this cell, Jack said, frustration finally breaking through his carefully maintained calm. I'm working on it, but bail hearings take time, and given the current charges, a judge could reasonably set bail high enough to keep you here for days if they wanted to make a point. Tora's expression softened slightly. I know how hard this is. I know every instinct you have is screaming at you to get back to that hospital, back to protecting Lena directly. But right now, the smartest thing you can do is exactly what you're already doing. Staying calm, staying controlled, refusing to give them the reaction they're hoping for. And if something happens to her while I'm sitting in here, Jack's voice cracked slightly, the first genuine fracture in his composure since the arrest. If something happens to Mason or to you because I couldn't be there, then it won't be because you failed her, Torres said firmly. It'll be because a corrupt judge and his desperate son decided that terrorizing an entire county was an acceptable price for protecting themselves. That's on them, Jack, not on you. Duh. 2 days crawled by with agonizing slowness, each hour bringing fresh anxiety that rippled through everyone connected to the case. Lena confined to her hospital bed with rising blood pressure that Dr. Whitfield watched with increasing concern, found herself unable to eat, unable to sleep, tormented by the knowledge that the one person who'd fought hardest to protect her now sat behind bars because of a confrontation Victor had deliberately engineered. Your blood pressure's elevated again, Whitfield said during her evening rounds, frowning at the monitor readouts. Lena, I understand the stress you're under, but you need to find some way to manage it for the baby's sake, if nothing else. This kind of sustained cortisol exposure isn't good for either of you this late in the pregnancy. How am I supposed to manage stress? Lena said, voice tight with barely contained tears. When the man who saved my life is sitting in a jail cell because he refused to hit back against the man who tried to kill me. Whitfield's expression softened, and for a moment the careful professional distance slipped, revealing something more personally invested underneath. I've been practicing medicine in this county for 18 years, she said quietly. I've watched Harold Hale's influence touch more lives than I can count, and always from a careful distance, always through other people's suffering rather than my own. This is the first time I've had a genuine front row seat to exactly how far that man will go to protect himself. She squeezed Lena's hand gently. For what it's worth, I don't think Jack Ryder's fight is over just because he's temporarily out of the picture. Men like that don't stay down. Meanwhile, in his cell, Jack held on to that same conviction with a discipline that surprised even himself, refusing every provocation from a cellmate who'd clearly been placed there deliberately to bait him into exactly the kind of violent outburst that would guarantee real charges instead of manufactured ones. Heard you're some big-shot biker president, the cellmate said on the second night, a wiry, twitchy man with prison tattoos and restless eyes that suggested he was working an angle rather than making conversation. Heard you roughed up some rich boy at the hospital? Bet that felt good, huh? Putting a rich boy in his place. Jack said nothing, staring at the ceiling, running through breathing exercises he hadn't used since his own reckless 20s when a hot temper had nearly cost him everything more than once. Come on, man, don't go quiet on me. I heard the whole thing, heard he's some judge's son. Must have felt real satisfying, knocking a little rich boy around. I didn't knock anybody around, Jack said finally, voice flat and controlled. And I'd think real hard about who exactly sent you in here asking me questions like that, because it sure as hell wasn't idle curiosity. The cellmate's smirk flickered just slightly, confirming exactly what Jack had already suspected. This wasn't a random assignment, wasn't coincidence. Someone wanted Jack agitated, wanted a real fight on record, wanted an actual violent incident to justify the manufactured one that had gotten him here in the first place. Just making conversation, the cellmate muttered, retreating to his bunk. Sure you were, Jack said quietly and closed his eyes, holding on to his composure with a grip that felt in that moment like the single most important act of his entire life. On the third day, Torres finally succeeded in forcing the security footage into the light, filing an emergency motion that cited obstruction and evidence suppression, clearly enough that even a sympathetic clerk's office found itself unable to keep stalling without generating a paper trail dangerous to everyone involved. The footage, once reviewed, told exactly the story Jack had insisted from the beginning. Victor Hale approaching aggressively, shoving Jack, first Jack's defensive response. Nothing more than an open palm push in reaction, entirely proportionate, entirely legally justified. Charges dropped, Torres said, practically bursting into the small interview room where Jack had spent the better part of 3 days waiting for exactly this news. The DA's office had no choice once the footage went public. There's already local news coverage running with it. Biker cleared in hospital, confrontation judge's son's account contradicted by video evidence. Harold Hale is losing control of the narrative in real time. Jack exhaled slowly, 3 days of tension finally beginning to unclench from his shoulders. How's Lena? Is she okay? Is the baby? She's stressed, exhausted, blood pressures have been elevated but stable, Torres said. She's been asking about you every single day. I think she needs to see you as much as you need to see her. The moment Jack walked back onto the 3rd floor of Mercy Ridge Hospital, 30 pounds of stress and 3 days of jail cell exhaustion clinging to him like a second skin. Lena's face broke into an expression of such raw, overwhelming relief that Jack felt something crack open in his own chest that he hadn't fully realized he'd been holding closed. You came back, she whispered, reaching for his hand the moment he reached her bedside. Told you I would, Jack said, voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. Told you the first night, I don't say things I don't mean. They tried to break you, Lena said. Tried to make you into exactly the kind of man Victor's lawyers wanted the world to see. They failed, Jack said simply, and every failed attempt just makes them more desperate, more visible, more careless. Torres thinks we're close, Lena, closer than any of us realized 3 days ago. Lena's hand tightened around his, and for the first time since the ravine, since the storm, since the entire nightmare had begun, something like genuine hope settled fully into her chest, instead of the fragile, tentative version she'd been rationing out to herself in careful doses. How close? She asked. Before Jack could answer, the door burst open, and Torres appeared with an expression that mixed exhilaration with grim urgency, in equal measure, phone still pressed to her ear as she finished a call. We just got federal authorization, Torres said, lowering the phone, eyes bright with the particular intensity of someone standing at the very edge of a breakthrough 15 years in the making. Warrants for Harold Hale's chambers, his home, his financial records, everything. We're moving at dawn tomorrow. The room went utterly still, the weight of that sentence settling over Jack and Lena like the final held breath before a storm finally breaks. Because after 3 days of watching the system bend and twist and nearly break under the weight of one man's corruption, dawn tomorrow was going to bring the reckoning that 15 years of grief, 2 years of quiet suffering, and 3 days of relentless fighting had all been building toward. Dawn came without any of the storm that had marked the beginning of this nightmare. Just a cold gray light spreading over the county as a convoy of federal vehicles moved simultaneously toward 3 locations: the courthouse Judge Harold Hale's chambers and the sprawling colonial house on Magnolia Ridge, where Harold had lived alone since his wife's death a decade earlier. A house that had come to represent in the eyes of everyone who'd ever crossed his path, the untouchable center of his empire. Torres led the team through the courthouse doors herself, federal warrant in hand, moving past a receptionist too stunned to do anything but stare as a dozen agents fanned out toward the judge's private chambers. Harold Hale was already at his desk when they arrived, dressed immaculately as always, and if he felt any genuine surprise at seeing federal agents flood into his sanctuary, he didn't show it. 30 years of controlled composure didn't crumble easily. Not even now. Agent Torres, Harold said, setting down his pen with deliberate slowness. I assume you have a warrant given the theatrics. Judge Hale, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, witness tampering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple counts related to a pattern of judicial corruption spanning at least a decade, Torres said, and there was something almost surgical in the calm way she delivered it, like a woman who'd rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times over 2 years of investigation and refused to let the satisfaction of finally saying it out loud show on her face. You have the right to remain silent. This is absurd, Harold said, rising slowly, still maintaining the posture of a man who believed even now that his position would somehow insulate him from consequence. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? I have sat on this bench for 30 years. I have appointed half the officials in this county, which is exactly why it took 2 years to build a case strong enough to survive your reach, Torres said. But it's built now, Judge. Elias Kramer's cooperating. Rebecca Hale's commitment records show clear signs of falsification. We're already cross-referencing with 2 other cases. Mason Gray's documentation corroborates a pattern going back over a decade. And the brake line evidence from your son's vehicle directly ties your family to attempted murder, which you personally tried to cover up by dispatching Kramer to tamper with evidence in an active investigation. Harold's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first genuine crack Torres had seen in his composure since walking through the door. Rebecca, he said quietly, almost to himself, you went that far back. We went exactly as far back as your corruption did, Torres said, nodding to the agent beside her, who stepped forward with handcuffs. Turn around, Judge Hale. For one long, suspended moment, Harold Hale stood motionless, staring at the cuffs at the agents filling his chambers, at the reflection of his own downfall, catching in the polished wood paneling that had witnessed 30 years of quiet, untouchable power. Then, with the same controlled dignity he'd carried through decades of manipulating a system built to serve him, he turned around and offered his wrists. You understand, he said, voice low, almost conversational, as the cuffs clicked shut, that men like me don't simply disappear because of an arrest. I have resources, connections. This will not end the way you think it will. Maybe not today, Torres said, but it ends, Judge. Every empire like yours ends eventually. You just spent 30 years believing you were the exception. Across town at the Colonial House on Magnolia Ridge, a second team of agents moved through Harold's private study, and it was there in a locked safe hidden behind a false panel in the washbowl, a detail Mason Gray had provided from memory, having glimpsed it once decades earlier, during a case that had gone very badly for him, that agents discovered the true scope of Harold Hale's 30-year reign. Financial records showing payments to at least 6 local officials over the past decade. Correspondence detailing the quiet institutionalization of 4 different women connected to cases the Hale family had wanted resolved without a trial. And buried at the very bottom, wrapped in a manila folder, yellowed with age, the original trial transcripts from Danny Ryder's manslaughter case, annotated in Harold's own handwriting, with notes that made it unmistakably, damningly clear the outcome had been predetermined before a single witness had ever taken the stand. When Torres called Jack from the courthouse steps to tell him what they'd found, his hand tightened so hard around his phone that his knuckles went white. He knew, Jack said, voice barely a whisper. The whole time, Danny was innocent, and he knew, and he sent him away anyway. I'm sorry, Jack, Torres said quietly. I know that doesn't undo 15 years. But it means Danny's case gets reopened, posthumously, but it happens. His name gets cleared. Jack stood in the hospital hallway, phone pressed to his ear, and felt 15 years of carefully managed grief finally break loose all at once, tears he hadn't allowed himself since the day they buried his brother, sliding silently down into his beard as Tank gripped his shoulder in wordless solidarity. It's over, Jack said, disbelief and grief and something like relief all tangled together in his voice. After 15 years, it's actually over. But even as Harold Hale sat in a federal holding cell for the first time in his adult life, his empire crumbling in real time across a dozen simultaneous investigations, Victor Hale remained free-cornered, desperate, and more dangerous than he had ever been, because a desperate man with nothing left to lose was capable of things a calculating one never would have risked. He arrived at Mercy Ridge Hospital just after noon, moving with the frantic, unraveling energy of someone whose entire world had collapsed in the span of a single morning, and he didn't bother with security checkpoints or polite requests at the nursing station. He simply pushed past a startled orderly and headed straight for the third floor, jaw clenched, eyes wild with the particular fury of a man who'd spent his whole life being protected from consequences and had just discovered, catastrophically, that the protection had run out. Tank spotted him first, stepping directly into his path outside Lena's room. "You need to turn around right now." "Get out of my way," Victor snarled. "That's my wife. That's my child. You have no right." "Your father's under federal arrest," Tank said, not moving an inch. "Your rights." Walked out the door with him. Victor lunged, shoving past Tank with a desperation that caught the big man off guard for just long enough to slip through, bursting into Lena's room with wild eyes and a voice cracking under the weight of everything collapsing around him. "You did this!" he screamed at Lena, who recoiled against her pillows, one hand flying protectively to her belly as the heart monitor beside her spiked with alarm. "You and your biker friends and that FBI agent, you destroyed everything. My father is in a federal cell because of you." "Victor, get out," Lena said, voice shaking, but resolute, years of learned fear finally giving way to something harder underneath. "I built a life," Victor continued, ignoring her entirely, spiraling deeper into his own unraveling. "I had everything, and you just had to survive, didn't you? You just had to crawl out of that ravine and ruin—" Jack's fist closed around Victor's collar before the man even registered his presence, hauling him backward out of the room with a controlled fury that would have terrified anyone paying close enough attention to the restraint it required. "You don't get to be in this room," Jack said, voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Not now, not ever again." "You've ruined my life," Victor screamed, thrashing uselessly against Jack's grip. "Both of you. My father built everything, and you tore it down in a week." "Your father built a prison for anyone who got in his way," Jack said. "You just happened to be standing closest when it finally collapsed." Security arrived within seconds. This time, no manufactured story to protect Victor. Now no father pulling strings behind the scenes. Just a desperate man being escorted off hospital property, while a police officer, alerted by the commotion, ran his name through dispatch and discovered an active federal hold had just been placed on Victor Hale not 20 minutes earlier, connected directly to the attempted murder charges. Torres's case had finally solidified enough to formally file. "Victor Hale," the officer said, cuffs already out. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, aggravated assault, and conspiracy." For the first time since the ravine, since the storm, since the beginning of this entire ordeal, Lena Carter watched through her hospital window as Victor Hale polished charming, untouchable. Victor Hale was walked out of Mercy Ridge in handcuffs, crying real tears for the first time in the entire saga. Tears that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the sudden, devastating realization that his father's power could no longer save him from anything. That night, alone in her room for the first time, without the immediate threat of Victor or Harold hovering over every breath she took, Lena felt something shift in her body that made her sit up sharply, a tightening low in her belly unlike anything she'd felt before. "Jack," she called out, voice tight with sudden alarm. "Jack, something's happening." Jack was through the door in seconds, followed immediately by a nurse who took one look at Lena's face and immediately paged for Dr. Whitfield. "It's too early." Lena gasped, another contraction rolling through her body, sharper this time. 31 weeks. It's too early. Something's wrong." "The stress of the last week," Whitfield said, arriving within minutes and moving with brisk, reassuring efficiency as she checked the monitors. "Elevated blood pressure, cortisol levels through the roof. It's not surprising her body's responding this way." "Lena, I need you to breathe with me. Okay, we're going to manage this together." "The baby," Lena said, gripping Jack's hand with a strength that surprised them both. "If she comes now, if she's too small." "NICU's the best in the region," Whitfield said firmly. "We've been preparing for exactly this possibility since the night you came in. You are not alone in this room, and neither is she." Jack stayed exactly where he was, Lena's hand crushing his fingers with every contraction, refusing to leave, even when hospital protocol technically should have moved him to a waiting room, because nobody on that floor, not Whitfield, not the nurses, not a single person who'd watched this entire ordeal unfold over the past week, was willing to be the one who told Jack Ryder he couldn't stay. "You're doing so good," Jack murmured, Through hours that blurred together into an exhausting, adrenaline-soaked stretch of contractions and monitors, and Whitfield's steady, calming voice cutting through moments of panic. You survived a ravine, Lena. You survived Harold Hale. You can survive this too. Talk to me, Lena gasped between contractions, sweat-soaked hair sticking to her forehead. Tell me about the carburetor, the panhead. You promised. Despite everything, despite the pain and the fear and the exhaustion, Jack found himself almost laughing. The memory of that first desperate ride to the hospital, flooding back with startling clarity. 11 winters, he said, voice thick with emotion he didn't bother hiding anymore. Rebuilt her from a rusted frame I found in a barn outside of Millfield. Every part original except the push, Lena, Whitfield's voice cut in sharp and focused. Right now, big push, you're almost there. What followed was a blur of controlled chaos of Whitfield's calm commands and Lena's exhausted, determined cries, and then cutting through everything else in the room, a thin, furious wail that made Jack's chest crack open with an emotion he had no name for. She's here, Whitfield said, voice breaking with relief as she lifted a small, impossibly tiny form. She's small, but she's breathing on her own. She's breathing. Hope, Lena whispered through exhausted tears, watching her daughter get whisked toward the NICU team, already waiting with practiced urgency. Her name is Hope. The days that followed unfolded with an exhausting mixture of fear and fragile joy, as Hope Carter fought for every ounce of strength in an incubator 3 floors down, her tiny chest rising and falling, with the assistance of machines that Lena watched through the NICU window for hours at a time, unable to hold her daughter but unwilling to leave her side even for a moment longer than necessary. Jack became a fixture in that NICU waiting room alongside Tank and Preacher and Diesel, a rotating vigil of leather-clad men who terrified visiting families until word spread through the hospital about exactly why they were there, at which point the fear transformed slowly into something like reverence. She's gaining weight, Whitfield reported on the 4th day, allowing herself the first genuine smile Lena had seen from the exhausted doctor in over a week. Slowly but steadily, her lungs are responding well to treatment. I'm cautiously, very cautiously optimistic. Cautiously optimistic, Lena repeated, testing the words like they might be too fragile to hold on to too tightly. I can work with cautiously optimistic. Meanwhile, Torres' investigation continued unraveling Harold Hale's 30-year empire with a momentum that seemed to accelerate daily. 2 more county officials were arrested on corruption charges directly tied to evidence found in Harold's safe. Rebecca Hale's commitment records were formally reviewed by an independent psychiatric board, and within a week, a judge, a genuinely impartial one, appointed from outside the county specifically to avoid any conflict of interest, ordered her immediate release from Ridgemont Behavioral 6 years after she'd first been silenced. Mason Gray was there when Rebecca walked out through those facility doors, older and thinner than the photographs he remembered from her file blinking against sunlight. She hadn't felt freely in 6 years, and the old lawyer wept openly, apologizing for every day it had taken him to find the courage to fight back. You have nothing to apologize for, Rebecca told him, her voice rusty from disuse but startlingly clear-eyed despite everything she'd survived. You're the reason I'm walking out of here at all. Danny Ryder's case was formally reopened within the same week, and though it would take months of legal process to fully clear his name, the initial review made one thing undeniable: the manslaughter conviction that had sent him to prison, that had ultimately cost him his life, had been built on evidence Harold Hale personally knew to be insufficient, manipulated, specifically to secure an outcome that served interests Jack was still even now piecing together the full scope of. He did it because Danny's testimony in an unrelated case threatened to expose one of his early corruption schemes. Torres explained to Jack one evening, laying out documents that finally, after 15 years, answered every question that had haunted him. Your brother wasn't just an unlucky man caught in a broken system, Jack. He was a specific target silenced because he knew something dangerous. Jack sat with that revelation for a long time, turning it over, feeling 15 years of grief transform into something both heavier and lighter, simultaneously heavier, because the injustice was even more deliberate than he'd ever imagined, and lighter because, for the first time, Danny's death had an answer instead of just an aching, unresolved silence. Thank you, Jack said finally, for not stopping until you found it. Thank Lena, Torres said. None of this happens without a woman who refused to stay quiet even after everything that family did to try to silence her. 2 weeks later, Hope Carter came home from the NICU small, still fragile but breathing steadily on her own, a survivor in the truest sense of the word, born into a storm, and carried through it by more hands than most children would ever know to be grateful for. Lena carried her daughter out of Mercy Ridge Hospital on a bright, clear afternoon that bore no resemblance to the storm that had brought her there weeks earlier, and waiting for her outside lined along the curb, in the same formation they'd held during that first terrifying custody hearing, sat every Harley belonging to Jack Ryder's chapter engines idling in a low, steady rumble that felt less like intimidation now and more like a promise fulfilled. "An honor guard," Lena said, laughing through tears as she approached Hope, wrapped snugly in a blanket against her chest. "For a baby who's not even a month old. For a family that earned it," Jack said, stepping forward to walk beside her toward the car Tank had arranged to drive them home in, since a motorcycle clearly wasn't an option for a newborn, no matter how much Preacher had joked about rigging up a sidecar. "What happens now?" Lena asked, settling carefully into the passenger seat with Hope secured against her chest. "Victor's awaiting trial. Harold's facing federal charges that could put him away for the rest of his life. Rebecca's finally free. Danny's case is being reopened. It feels like the story should be over, but I don't actually know what comes next for me." Jack leaned against the car door, considering the question with the same careful weight he gave everything. "What comes next," he said, "is whatever you decide it should be. You're not running from anything anymore, Lena. You're not hiding. You're not pretending. You're not waiting for the next car door to open. Whatever you build from here, you're building it as a free woman." Lena looked down at her sleeping daughter, at the small, fierce face that had survived a ravine before she'd even been born, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Not relief exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but something closer to purpose. "I want to build something," she said slowly, the idea forming even as she spoke it aloud for the first time. "For women like Rebecca, like the three others Kramer described, the ones who got silenced before they ever had a chance to fight back. Someone should have been there for them the way you were there for me." "Then build it," Jack said simply. "You've about 60 men who'd stand guard outside any building you needed protected, if that's ever what it takes." 6 months later, on a mild spring afternoon, considerably gentler than the storm that had started everything, a modest storefront on 5th Street, not far in fact from Mason Gray's old office above the laundromat, opened its doors under a hand-painted sign reading, "The Hope Foundation, Support for Survivors," with Lena Carter standing behind a simple desk inside Hope, babbling contentedly in a bouncer chair beside her. Already sturdy and thriving in ways the doctors had once been afraid to promise. Victor Hale's trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier, ending in a conviction on all counts: attempted murder conspiracy, aggravated assault, with a sentencing that would keep him behind bars for at least the next 25 years. Harold Hale's federal trial, more complex given the sheer scope of 30 years of documented corruption, was still ongoing, but the evidence was so overwhelming, so thoroughly corroborated by Kramer's cooperation, Mason Gray's decade of preserved documentation, and the testimony of 4 separate women his schemes had silenced over the years, that even Harold's most expensive legal team privately acknowledged there was no version of this trial that ended with him walking free. Mason Gray had been reinstated to the state bar in a ceremony that brought tears to more eyes than his own, standing now as Rebecca Hale's formal legal counsel in a civil suit against the Hale estate that promised to finally provide her some measure of restitution for 6 stolen years of her life. Rebecca herself had begun volunteering at Lena's foundation twice a week, finding in the work a purpose that helped fill the enormous gap those missing years had carved into her life. And Jack Ryder Harden, club president, grieving brother, unlikely protector, stood at the back of the small crowd gathered for the foundation's opening, watching Lena address a room full of local reporters and county residents with a confidence that hadn't existed in the broken, terrified woman he'd pulled from a ravine 6 months earlier. "People ask me sometimes who saved my life," Lena said, her voice carrying clear and strong across the small gathered crowd, Hope now asleep peacefully in her arms. "They expect me to talk about doctors, about the hospital, about the legal system finally working the way it's supposed to. And I understand why they expect that answer. It's the comfortable one. It's the one that doesn't require anyone to examine why a woman had to nearly die in a ditch before anyone in power was willing to listen to her." She paused, scanning the crowd until her eyes found Jack's holding his gaze with a warmth that needed no further explanation. But the truth is, Lena continued, it wasn't the system that saved me. The system spent 30 years protecting the man who tried to kill me. It was a group of bikers that most of this county had spent years crossing the street to avoid men. Everyone told me to fear men society had already decided weren't worth trusting, who stopped on a stormy night and refused to leave me to die. It was a disbarred lawyer who kept fighting long after everyone else told him it was hopeless. It was an FBI agent who spent 2 years chasing a case nobody believed she could ever crack. It was every single person this county underestimated banding together to do what the powerful, respected, untouchable men in charge never once had the courage to do. She looked down at Hope, sleeping soundly against her chest, thriving despite everything the world had tried to take from her before she'd even taken her first breath. My daughter is alive today, Lena said, voice thick with emotion but unwavering. Because the people everyone told me to fear, they're the only ones brave enough to stop. And if this foundation does nothing else, I want it to be a reminder that justice doesn't always wear a badge or sit behind a judge's bench. Sometimes it rides in on a Harley in the middle of a thunderstorm, and it doesn't ask permission before it decides you're worth saving. The crowd erupted into applause, and Jack Ryder, a man who'd spent 15 years believing the fight against men like Harold Hale was already lost, who'd carried his brother's unanswered injustice, like a stone in his chest for over a decade, felt something finally fully settle inside him, a peace he hadn't known he was still waiting for. Because on a stormy night that should have ended in death, a woman had refused to stop crawling. A stranger had refused to keep driving past. And together they had proven once and for all that even the most powerful, most corrupt, most untouchable empires eventually meet the one thing they never accounted for. People who simply refuse to stay quiet and refuse to stop fighting, no matter how impossible the odds appear. Lena Carter survived. Hope Carter thrived. Rebecca Hale was free. Danny Ryder's name was finally cleared. And in a small storefront on 5th Street in a county that had spent 30 years believing justice belonged only to the powerful, a new kind of family had risen from the wreckage of a stormy night, proof permanent and undeniable that no empire built on fear and silence lasts forever, and that the truth, however long it's buried, always finds its way back into the light.